lie in the hot tubs this week and listen to various people planning the fates of millions of people, discussing, where the economic zones in the Soviet Union should be opened up, how the diplomatic crisis in China should be resolved. I mean, people who just routinely take it upon themselves to run the world for the rest of us. There's a deeper level. This is a slight turn on this, but there's a deeper level on this idea, to this idea of pragmatism, which I was thinking about because I was thinking about yesterday's lecture and how it was a lot of information. And I wondered what other lectures might be like that would be so full of information. And then I reviewed in my mind the history of art from the point of view of realism. Realism is this funny thing where people painted on their bodies and scarified themselves and painted in styles that have been rediscovered in the 20th century. Impressionism, symbolism, abstract expressionism. We see all this in the cave paintings in Africa and in southern France and so forth and so on. But once the Greeks got their camp in order, they set off in this funny direction, which was they wanted marble to be like flesh. They did not want to symbolize the human form or evoke it or make an image of it. They wanted to find out what it was by duplicating it exactly. And they were able to do this and produced, these things, which I don't know if any of you have visited the museum at the Parthenon or the Metropolitan in New York City. You get it from this Greek stuff. I mean, I think even if you're pretty lumpen, you suddenly understand what art is about, why people pay $11 million for a piece of marble. Because what real genius is, you have to put out your hand to satisfy yourself that this is not real breathing human flesh. And these faces, have minds behind them. And when you stand and look into them, you say, so this is what the thing about Greece is all about. Now I understand that some kind of magical thing. Well, Eleusis was this central focus for the mystical intentionality of the Greek mind. This ties in with this thing that William Blake said about attend the minute particulars. Remember, we talked about that, he said this was the basis of poetry, and understanding reality was attention to the minute particulars. So there is a way of opening beyond symbols, beyond language, and we call it realism, but we don't recognize it for what it is. I mean, realism is thought of as another ism, but it isn't another ism, it's an ontos of a completely different order. There are isms and there is realism. And realism seeks to go beyond isms, to go beyond language, to go beyond expectation and the forward-moving net of language, and to present us with something which is, shocking and infinitely deep and beyond contravention. This is the thing. And so this thing has been carried forward mostly in art, mostly as an intuition. It's not clear to me that it's ever been exactly articulated as a philosophy, but this is what the light of Caravaggio and, the recessional distances of the brothers Van Eyck and, Turner and all of this stuff, it's a going into the stuff of the world without preconception, attempting, the great discovery that shadows are not always black. Somebody had to look to figure that out, and then to embody it against the flow of all understanding. The discovery of perspective is this peculiar episode in the history of Western thought that is never discussed sufficiently. We are asked to believe that somewhere between the death of Giotto and the death of Michelangelo, European human beings suddenly understood that things got smaller the further away from you they were, and therefore created the world of pictorial space that we have inhabited ever since. Well, you know, in an earlier lecture I told the story about how Thomas Aquinas proved his sanctity by being able to look at open books and then later tell what he had read without ever moving his lips. This was silent reading, and it was viewed as a miracle by his contemporaries because they all had to vocalize while they read. Well, this is a similar kind of phenomenon, this sudden popping into existence of the recessional distance and the whole set of understandings that allows us to navigate three-dimensional space. What is happening here? Does language make way for this stuff? Is it biological? Is it just happen to happen during the Italian Renaissance? How can a convention of painters of a courtly class become a way of inhabiting space and time for the entire population of an ancient continent? It defies understanding. What is actually being tracked is some kind of recent readjustment of the information processing values in the human brain-mind system. And these things are very close to the surface and very easily perturbed. You know, Julian Jaynes, in his book about the bicameral mind, felt that there had been a major shift in the construction of consciousness at the time of Homer. That before Homer, people didn't exactly have egos. They were sort of like soulless beings which, when put under pressure by like a tight situation in battle, would have a magical voice speak to them in their head and tell them what to do. And they called this their demon, their familiar, their titulary animal or god, and then he felt that this autonomous function of the psyche later became incorporated into the larger structure of the human mind as the ego, and that what we use as an ego was once a god. This is the depths to which we have fallen, that we, you know, have shackled a god into the service of managing our portfolios. You know, it's a principle that's very old in nature. For instance, mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the human cell, are these little enzymatic engines that were originally free-swimming bacteria that have been, through evolution, incorporated into the dynamics of larger structures and embedded there. And now their energy is all channeled to the purposes of the cell. And they have their own genetic material and everything. They are clearly relict organisms embedded in cytoplasmic material. So this principle of incorporation of the autonomous element to enrich the original structure is pretty well there. An instance of that I'm interested in is the pregnancy of language in these Amazonian tribes that are using Banisteriopsis type hallucinogens. I mean, something is trying to happen. This language is just subvisible, and the whole mystery that haunts the culture is that it isn't always subvisible. That, you know, on good Saturday nights, when everything is clicking, they can actually drag out this stuff from another dimension and play with it. And you just wonder, you know, the beta-carbolines are so closely related to endogenous brain chemistry, and so is the DMT that it's running on. I mean, clearly these people are rubbing up against an evolutionary interface spot, a place where human ability, human neural processing, human signal-making functions are bubbling together with the potential of a sudden perturbation to a higher and previously unanticipated state of order. And I think that it has something to do with this projective imagination through acoustical sound, that this idea has haunted the human mind, and certainly the Western mind, through the tradition of Pythagoreanism and the Orphic religions, this tradition of using sound to perform magic and transcend levels and see into the fabric of nature. And what's going on in these Amazon situations where, you know, the conventions of modern physics mean nothing. Nobody's speaking English. Nobody knows about the periodic table or Newton or any of that. They're operating in another world. And what they're doing is, in these states of intoxication, projecting this phenomenon for which we don't even have a word. I mean, telepathy is a thin notion. Telepathy is, I think, you hear me think. That's not what this is. This is that these people can project whole scenarios of three-dimensional phenomena that are part of a group perception that is not operating under the will of individuals, but that is somehow the élan vital, the life force of the group itself. I mean, we don't have a sociological vocabulary for this stuff. Anthropologists talk about manas and magic and, you know, morphogenetic fields and this and that and the other hand. But this is reductionism, because the living fact of this stuff is pretty astonishing.
So, to change the subject, you mentioned the heretics in your talk this afternoon, that Syrian sect, was it?
The Mandaeans.
The Mandaeans. And we talked earlier, before coming in, also of the uses of heresy and your passion for them. I wonder if you'd link that to what we should
heresy.
do. Link that to what action to take.
Well, it's always, heresy is always safe. If you're scripting your life for the history books, you just can't go wrong as a heretic, because they're always vindicated. The trouble is there can be some rough spots along the way. A favorite heretic of mine is Giordano Bruno, who some of you may know about, who was burned at the stake as the price of his commitment to heresy. Bruno discovered the infinity of the universe. That's what he discovered. He looked into the night sky and was the first person in Europe to say, those aren't adamantine shells of Aristotelian crystalline spheric material. Those are stars. Those are suns like our sun, and they must go on forever. It opened before him. And he was burned at the stake. The period that is so rich in heresy and has been a great inspiration for me is the Hellenistic syncretism that follows upon the classical period in Greece and the rise of Roman power, and at the same time ferment in the Jewish end of the Mediterranean to create. And all kinds of things were happening, actually. There were gymnosophists coming from India teaching yoga in the 2nd century BC in Rome. And there were, you know, Egyptian followers of Thoth and Isis. And there were Dosethians and Montanists and followers of Simon the magician. And these were a vast spectrum of cults, ranging from Orthodox Jewish cults, such as the Nabateans, and the Zealots, and presumably the Mandaeans that I mentioned earlier. And then there were Jewish mysticism infected with Platonic ideas, Philo-Judaeus, Apollodorus, Musaeus, all these minor philosophers were teaching. There were Pythagoreans, there were atomists, and the most interesting of these were proto-Christian, neo-Christian, pseudo-Christian, crypto-Christian sects that were competing with what eventually became Christianity. Some of you may know of this sect that did some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nabateans, who lived outside of Jerusalem and down in the Dead Sea. These were the people that James Pike was investigating when he died in the Negev. A few years ago, well, actually over many years, was a very important manuscript find in 1948 at a place called a Greek Orthodox monastery called Chenoboskion in Upper Egypt that was on a much older site called Nag Hammadi. And out of the ground at Nag Hammadi came 43 codices that were by groups of scholars coordinated worldwide, translated through the 50s and 60s and 70s. This is now available as the Nag Hammadi Library. And it's very, very interesting stuff, because this stuff went into the ground AD 270. So the later bishops, the patristic recensionists, the diddlers and fiddlers and all of that were kept away from it. Nobody had seen this stuff since AD 280. So it was very, very interesting. Of the 53 texts, 41 were unknown in any other version. Of those that were known, there was some of the late Plato. There was portions of Matthew, but what was interesting were these previously unknown texts, some of which were very close to gospel type material, a gospel according to Philip, the second known version of the Gospel of Philip, a gospel according to Thomas, the doubter, my favorite guy. But more interesting is the less pseudo-Christian material, this exegetical and mystical material that just takes off, that is proto-Hermetic. Some of it shows traces of Indian philosophies, transmigration of souls, yogic practices. Some of it reads almost like Maria Sabina's mushroom chants. There's one text called The Voice of the Thunder that has a meter and a rhythm that is precisely Maria Sabina. So Gnosticism is the general banner under which all of this stuff can be placed. Gnostics believe, the central tenet of Gnosticism, and it's hard to put this across because modern Gnostics are such cheerful people, but they've forgotten their real roots. The central perception of Gnosticism, no matter how you slice it, is that we don't belong here, that we are strangers, that something terrible happened, and that accounts for why we're here, that we were destined for a much better deal, and something went terribly, terribly wrong. It takes different forms. Some Gnostic mythologies are fairly straightforward. Some are fairly Baroque. The one that I enjoy is one of the more Baroque ones. The 2nd century Gnostic bishop Valentinius had this notion that there were 36 archons. They are demons of progressively lessening power that interpose themselves between man and a true vision of God. And the last of the archons, the 36th archon, was Sophia, and the only of the archons that was female. There's a tremendous sexual ambivalence in Gnosticism, which we can talk about, which is resolved in different ways. But anyway, the 36th archon is Sophia. She looked upward toward the higher God and saw him bring forth creation, of which she was the final manifestation. And in her heart, an avarice grew, a wish to create in the same manner as the highest and hidden All-Father. And she brought forth, it's described as an abortion. She self-fertilized herself. She did not understand the requisites of creation, and she turned inward into herself, and she brought forth a monstrosity. And this monstrosity is the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, Jehovah. And when she saw what she had done, that she had brought forth this monstrosity, she flashed through a whole bunch of emotions very quickly. Horror, guilt, rage, fear, agony, like that. And these emotions of the errant Sophia condensed as the material world over which Ildabuath was then made Lord. So the entire material universe is seen as the condensed emotional debris of the horror of the 36th archon upon witnessing her own creation, who is then made God over this universe. Well, even though this is this really bad scene, it still nevertheless has this extremely tenuous connection to the highest and hidden All-Father in the form of what is called the scintilla, the spark, the soul spark of divinity. So then the goal of Gnostics, born into this unfortunate world, is to gather the light together, to save the light. The light is defiled by its presence in the world of material existence, and the light must be gathered. Well, so then the central soteriological concern, that means the central salvational concern of Gnosticism, is how shall we gather the light? And their whole theology then is, what is the light? How should we gather it? And once we have it, what do we do with it? And then there were various answers. I mentioned the sexual tension inside Gnosticism. It took two forms, both wild extremes. In one case, Gnostic hermeneutics reasoned along the following lines. Life is defiled, the light is defiled by the material universe. Therefore, we should withhold entry of the light into matter. Therefore, we must be celibate. We must have no children. And in some cases, this took the form of saying, and we sanction no form of sexual union which could lead to procreation. So they were kinky in that style. The other direction that they took was extreme celibacy. Just simply no sexual contact whatsoever. And then the third option, and these options had differing percentages of loyalty as Roman society underwent exterior transformations. The third Gnostic stance was, man is divine. We are of the light, and nothing in the universe of Ildabuath can pollute the light, for it is of a higher order, and therefore we can do anything we want. Yes, so you could be a Gnostic and line up for scourges and heavy dieting, or you could line up for total libertinism and eating and drinking anything you want and any kind of... So this was the spectrum, and this was, of course, very baffling to Christian morality. But Christianity has an incredible debt to Gnosticism. I mean, the Gospel of John and Revelations. I mean, this whole bit, in the beginning was the Word, this notion of the going forth of the Word, this is thoroughly Gnostic. And the struggle between light and darkness, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness comprehend it not. This is essentially the Manichaean thing, which is a form of Gnosticism. Manichaeanism is a dualistic Persian religion that had great sway in Persia through this slightly later phase. Mani was its prophet. Mani was a Mandaean. His father was a priest in the Mandaean faith. Well, why talk about this so much? Well, I don't know. Permission for heresy is never a bad idea. And I think this is an important issue which is not resolved. I mean, we are all love bunnies of one sort or another. But what do you do about this thing? Are we of the earth? Is it our charge and our destiny? Or are we from another place? You can't have it both ways. This is a pretty clear division. What are we to be? Are we to integrate with nature? Or are we to transcend it through an act of conjuration out of the self, which is what culture is? I mean, apparently we have made the choice, and all we're doing now is the philosophical dotting of the I's. Our commitment to technology is thoroughly Gnostic. Our commitment to... we believe that nature is something that withholds secrets from us, that we must wrest the secrets of nature from it in order to somehow complete ourselves. And, modern Gnosticism plays all this down. Modern Gnosticism is existential and capitalizes more on the idea of abandonment. They're less interested in the program for returning to the higher and hidden All-Father, and much more interested in talking about how we are abandoned by the All-Father, and therefore what a drag it is and what can we do about it. So that people like Heidegger are thoroughly Gnostic in their thinking. I mean, anybody who is not... Because you see, what Gnosticism denied was the presence of God in the world. You need to understand that it was an article of faith of Gnostics, that this is really a long way from God, that we are really off, way, way out, over, away from it. And Christianity preserves this dualism in the eternality of evil, in the idea that, there isn't a final fusion. They preserve the distinction down to the last knell of recorded time. So that's a thoroughgoing dualism. But my approach to this kind of thing is basically Jungian. I mean, that's where I got my interest in all of this material. See, I think that what we're always seeing is psyche, that we're always seeing a mirroring of the intentionality of ourselves to concretize consciousness, to put a name on it. And so I have called myself at times a noetic archaeologist. What I like to do is go and dig up, not pot shards and glass beads, but ideas. Old ideas that have been under the dirt a long, long time. And this is what I essentially did here with the I Ching. And Gnosticism is another boneyard, and alchemy is another boneyard, and the Maya are another boneyard, and ancient Hawaii is another. And I love to go into these things and draw conclusions, It's all very pregnant with intention toward the person who comes to it with an open mind. I mean, everything wants to speak, everything wants to guide us. I haven't talked much about it, but I always think there are so many ways in which it's true that it would have been so much different if Aldous Huxley had guided things through the turmoil of the 1960s. Aldous Huxley was, you know, a British intellectual, a novelist, a social critic. But even before he wrote The Doors of Perception, he wrote a book called, or an essay called The Art of Seeing. And, you know, this was gospel as far as my mother was concerned. I mean, my mother was an extraordinary woman. I don't know how she had the intuition to be into the things that she was into. But it's this thing about seeing. And this goes back to what I was saying about realism, training the eye. What these Renaissance people and these Greek people were doing with the recessional distances and the nudes was they were really looking. They were really seeing. They were not painting stories that they were telling in their minds, but they were actually paying attention to texture and shadow and light. And this learning to see, taught very early, is a tremendous inoculation against cultural viruses, value viruses and linguistic viruses. Because, and you don't see if you grow up with television. You know, television is something that you look at. It's like it has this flat quality. It is undemanding. Everything has been stripped of depth before it ever reaches you, even to be offered for your perception.
Well, what do you think about the more Cubist? Once Picasso brought in Cubism and changed the entire direction of art away from realism and into a different view of seeing things, from many facets, and broken down into other, in a sense, from other dimensions.
Well, I'm surprised at my stirring defense of realism, because I'm much more sympathetic to my interest in art history was always 20th century art, and what I loved was the upheaval and the screw you attitude. I mean, I was thinking today as I thought about this lecture about myself as a 13-year-old kid and who were my heroes. It wasn't baseball players and it wasn't even astronauts. It was Jackson Pollock. And, that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to be a kid from Wyoming who went to New York and drank hard in bars and produced paintings that 99% of everybody hated, and that I would insist were in fact works of staggering genius. And I would triumph. And it was this whole thing. I mean, I was living in a small town in western Colorado, you have to understand. I mean, the notion of a man hurling paint at a canvas, it just outraged the inner Amish of the place where I was living. No, I think all of this stuff is very important, and that art, I didn't mean to suggest a value judgment in favor of realism over other artistic styles, because I think by the time the 20th century came around, realism had grown self-defeating. It was something which had to be pried loose and perfected. And for me, I think it's probably perfected in Jan van Eyck. The altarpieces of the Van Eyck brothers, or Caravaggio, or by the time you get to Velázquez and the Mannerists, something else is happening. It's like they've overshot the mark. With Mannerism, it's getting weird. It looks at first like realism, but then you realize that bizarrely morbid distortions are taking place, and that what is seeping upward into the realist canvas is the unconscious, and that these odd intimations of sadomasochism and mania and all this stuff that you're getting off of this stuff, it's not you, it is there. They're trying to make it like that. And the Mannerists set the stage for full permission to push off into then Romanticism, really. The evocation of emotion through the manipulation of image, of natural image, but it's really, the thinking is not realistic, the thinking is allegorical. Romanticism always tends toward allegory. That's why these islands sucked at by blackened water and covered over in fallen gardens and crumbling ruins, these don't exist anywhere. This is not reportage of the natural world. These are dreamscapes of a morbid imagination. Okay, well, so then it all runs out in the 19th century. I mean, for my money, 19th century art is pretty dismal. It's very much of the Academy. In France, you've got Watteau and Fragonard, and in England, you have, Reynolds and all of this stuff going on, until this romantic morbidity gives rise to, out of the recrudescence of that movement come people like Redon and Moreau, the French symbolists. And this is consequent upon, interestingly enough, an interest in psychedelic drugs. These people are smoking hashish and drinking absinthe and are familiar with opium and this kind of thing. And they set the stage then for the pre-Raphaelite thing, and which I don't know whether you view that as design or art, but simultaneously Impressionism is happening. And Impressionism, strangely enough, is like art in the service of the realist ideal again, but in strange clothing. Because what they were trying to do was shed this academic, allegorical, symbolic stuff and just show light. It was an effort to do that. And it gave permission for, another thing then. So there were two simultaneous tendencies there. The Impressionists with their concern with what the eye sees and light, and then operating in the background stuff like the pataphysicians and the Dadaists later, where it was all about, again, the unconscious and bringing that in. The same tendency which had infected mannerism then came in as surrealism in the 20th century, and because of Freud and Jung and all this stuff. So I think that the whole history of 20th century art is a reaction against morbid romanticism, which was probably a pretty good thing to overthrow. But I saw people like Pollock, or specifically Pollock, as in a sense realists, in that what they were showing us was chaos.
That's sort of the evolution of an artist as you gain more and more ability, as you get past the symbols and you get into realism. But then you take the realism and you use it as you can use it as a fiction in a sense, so you can do what the Mannerists did and go into a dream state, so it becomes a language, a visual language that can describe things that our words can't.
Well, Pollock made an immense intellectual journey, because he started out he was born in Cody, Wyoming. This is a strike against you in the first place. And he studied art under Thomas Hart Benton, who was the absolute epitome of the American realist school. I mean, if you don't know Thomas Hart Benton, he did WPA murals of women bringing jugs of cider to men in the fields at noontime. In other words, glorification of the American working class in a style almost reminiscent of the Mexican mural style of Diego Rivera. Pollock came out of that, he used a screwdriver, was his major instrument, and he stood back or stood over his canvases on stepladders and whipped paint across them and built up these layered things that were just amazing. And what they were the abstract expressionist equivalent of an atomic explosion. This is what the 50s was all about. So realism came to mean looking into many strange parts of reality.
You know, at what point does the dream get integrated to where it's us? At the point where we control it like we control our voice in our head?
Well, we have this admiration for the Australian style of relating to the dream time. But if we continue to develop our technology the way we do, we have our own dream time. It's watching television, and it's probably going to deepen. I mean, I think that our appetite for sensation and entertainment is driving that industry to develop itself almost more rapidly than any other. And because it's all mythic, what's on television. Television is not reality. Television is the cultural myth about reality. This is where the archetypes in the American unconscious are to be met, tough cops and jiggle blondes and all these people that are in our cultural mass programming are running around in there. Oh, it's terrible. It's just that we have such a tacky set of images. It could be epical. Imagine if we were 19th century Germans. Television would be like Wagner.
You just did it. I wanted you to switch and do a similar kind of historic analysis that you did for Gnosticism and for art and music as well. Overview and shifts.
Well, I don't claim to know a lot about music.
What did Wagner represent?
Well, Wagner comes late.
What's that late?
What I would say about I think music is very important. We said in here on a different day that architecture was frozen music, and therefore music must be unfrozen architecture. And what did you mean? What could you say about that? This Pythagorean thing, this very old thing, this discovery of these apparently natural relationships that are very mysterious between the plucked strings, so that if you stretch gut between bone antlers and you pluck certain strings, other strings in a perceived to be natural relationship called an octave will also vibrate in harmony. This is the key concept here, harmony. People saw this, and Pythagoras, or apocryphally, what Pythagoras did was he filled glass tubes with water, and when he had two glass tubes tuned so that they were an octave apart, it was observed that the amount of water in them could be expressed as a mathematical ratio. Well, this touches on a very mysterious aspect of things that nobody quite understands, and you don't even hear people talk about it because it's so problematic. And that is this: why does mathematics have something to do with nature? Why does mathematics have anything to do with nature? Think about what mathematics is. Mathematics is the operations you can perform on numbers. Well, nature isn't, you don't see numbers. And yet, this has been the fundamental insight of the Western mind that has allowed miracle after demonic miracle to be conjured out of nature. The discovery of the curious parallelism between nature and operations performed on numbers. Well, it comes out of this Pythagorean religious mentality, which observed, these ratios and related them to the sounds and said, well, then there can be a mathematical theory of music. And then they observed regularity in other phenomena. The stars had long been observed to be regular. Well, so then they began to think in terms of regular, perfect things versus irregular, mundane things. And in this climate, Platonism was able to come into being. And Platonism makes an absolute division, between the world of archetypal, perfect things and then the lower slice of reality. Music was carrying all of this along. And if you're interested in ancient music and its impact on ancient philosophy, these books by MacLean, The Myth of Invariance, is one of them. It's a study of mathematics in Plato and the Rig Veda, and it's all musical mathematics. They were studying proportion, harmony, relationship. Now notice that in this situation where the string is plucked and the other strings in octaves above and below vibrate, this is a very cogent demonstration of action at a distance, something which is very troubling even in modern conceptions. But it's a very cogent demonstration of action at a distance. It shows that there need not be a connecting medium for force and activity to be transmitted across space. In other words, it is an argument for magic, for etheric influences, and this sort of thing. And so then the theory quickly grew that obviously then the way to influence these things was through music, through sound, and theories of tone grew up. And the 7 planetary bodies that were familiar to the astrologers were connected to 7 tones, and then a correspondence was recognized between 7 metals, and a map of the world was slowly constructed that had music at its ultimate basis. There's a wonderful book that deals in part with all of this that some of you may know, called Hamlet's Mill. Hamlet's Mill is the story of this very old myth that occurs all over the world about how somebody has a mill, a little grinder, and somebody else steals it, and then the thief rows across a body of water with the mill in a boat, and the mill sinks the boat, and the mill is grinding out salt. And this is, in one version, the explanation for why the ocean is salty. It's because off the coast of Norway, in that place called the Maelstrom, that is the mill, and down at the bottom it is grinding out salt. And Giorgio de Santayana, who wrote this book, Hamlet's Mill, with Hilda von Dechend, talked about it as a myth of a movement of the stellar machinery, that stars which were near the pole moved beneath the surface of the sea, and the mill was lost, and a whole world age was thrown into confusion. And a lot of the discussion of this hinges on looking at Rig Vedic and Platonic musical theory. These ayahuasca songs in the Amazon are visually intended. They are to be seen, not to be heard. I mean, the people criticize them that way, they critique them that way. Voice is primarily a vehicle imagined to affect color vision. And, if we could see what we meant, the ambiguity would leave our intention to communicate with each other. This would be a kind of telepathy, the seeing of meaning. Well, when you think about what meaning is, there's no reason why it should be processed through hearing. It's not particular, it has nothing particularly to do with hearing. Meaning is a much fuller and richer signal than hearing. Why shouldn't it be conveyed visually? When I look at this room, I'm not listening to it. I'm looking at it, and the meaning of what is going on comes to me through my eyes. This is how the meaning of the world presents itself. We don't listen to the world, but we listen to speech for its meaning. And this closes us toward many things and pushes us in a certain direction.
We don't have any medium that we can physically produce, other than our electronic medium, that we can easily produce a visual image to share.
Print. When we read.
But you mean conversationally and instantaneously, right?
Like you can with speech.
Well, yeah, this is where you have to take drugs to push the argument further, because what you have to hypothesize is that it might be possible to generate an acoustical hologram with your voice or something like that. In other words, when you take ayahuasca with these people in the jungle and you see the songs, the reason you see the songs is because you're loaded. Well, how loaded do you have to be to see the songs would be a good question for researchers to ask. Maybe you don't have to be overtly stoned at all. Maybe you could have a sub-threshold amount of harmine in your system, and when they started singing, lo and behold, here it would appear.
Is it not possible, theoretically possible at any rate, that once this has happened in your system, whatever this has gone through physiologically and whatever other way, that the path is there, that there would be a way to learn that thing, that you could do it on Thursday morning?
On the natch.
Isn't that what your brother was trying to do with the sounds in the Amazon?
See, there is something going on here, because in the pineal gland, harmine is produced. And DMT is produced in the brain too. So the chemical prerequisites for the brain state are there. I think the first meeting we held, I talked about the fact that people who have smoked DMT then report months, years later, dreams in which they smoke DMT, and it happens in the dream. Okay, this is a major piece of evidence. This means it can happen, that it's not chemically exogenous. But then the question is, how the hell do you get to the same place as you are in a dream when someone passes you the glass pipe? But the very fact that it can happen, and so then, so it lies very close to the level, to the level of consciousness, you see. And these people who've been in the Amazon all these 20,000 years that we've been calling primitive, while we've been inventing technology and doing all this other stuff, what they've been doing is every Saturday night exposing themselves to a linguistic catalyst. Well, so we think, well, maybe they have a really far-out language. No, they don't have a really far-out language. They have an entirely ontically transformed linguistic ability that we don't even have a suspicion of, that is learnable. And I don't know, because they put so much stress on this diet, it's very clear that they are diddling towards something. They have a goal that they're trying to maximize. There is something there that they want to get. And when you meet many ayahuasqueros and take it with many of these guys, the guys who make the good stuff are all alike. They have this weird aura. They have a voice thing that is hard to describe. But you know the concept of voice in Dune, where there was a way to just drop down a register and speak in a way that people could not resist because you set the vibe in this certain way. These ayahuasqueros have this, and they have yes, it's something so outside our cultural value system that we can hardly realize what we're doing with, because how many of us would go there And then how many of us would go there and go deep enough and then take the drug with these people and then be enough free of your own stuff to pay attention to what they were putting out and then to keep it enough together to create a description that you could bring back later. So, it's just, the world is not empty of the new and the novel, these frontiers. This is how I ended the lecture yesterday. There are just frontiers and frontiers and frontiers in chemistry and anthropology and ethnography, and some of it we're actually talking about, the transformation of the human form, and not through technology, but in a cleaner, biologically, a way which celebrates natural process and celebrates the vitality of the minded portion of the planet. It's an attunement, not this Gnostic thing which I evoked for you, which is, people used to say of my grandfather, where he'd been was so-so, where he was hell, and where he was going was paradise. And he lived his whole life that way. Well, that's a Gnostic attitude, Paradise is just ahead. I think that paradise is a frontier of language, of intentional communication. The reason for looking at all these things, for looking at the hallucinogens and the alchemy and the mythology and all this, is because these are the materials present at hand for an assault on the citadel of true being. Somewhere here there is a clue. Somewhere here there is something that we can use. It's going to be an obscure sect, a peculiar mantra, a strange drug, a bizarre plant, a forgotten teaching, a lost alphabet, something that we can use so that, I've talked about the tantric nature of the point of view that I'm putting out. Tantric in the sense of the definition of Tantra as the short path, taking seriously the idea that in a single lifetime a human being might be able to go vast distances in the project of spiritual unfolding, that we are not given or fated to simply incrementally advance ourselves. It is some kind of a lottery. There are big winners, and I'm just very convinced that the way you enhance your position in the probability of all of this is through cognition. It will be an act of understanding. The final act of liberation will be an act of understanding. Okay, well that's it for today, folks. This belief that the world is entirely independent of our minds and objective and unaware of us is the kind of scientific fiction in which we operate, and then the real truth that appears to our perceptions, the truth of our immediate experience, is that the mind is a concentric field of diminishing intensity that can draw events and circumstances far from the ranges of probability. I had the following experience. It's all anecdotal, you see. I was in a dry wash in the Negev desert, and there was absolutely no food, and I was a poor traveling hippie, a hashashin, and a cave dweller, and a ne'er-do-well. And it was like 120 degrees outside my cave. And I was sitting in front of my cave, smoking hash. And out through the shimmering heat, I could see this dot of a person. And as I watched them making their way through the rocks and the scrub, I began to have a fantasy about this person, that they had food, that they didn't simply have food, that they had oysters Rockefeller packed in ice, that they had Russian caviar, that they had Belgian chocolate, that they had all of this stuff. And, you know, I hadn't had a bath in 3 weeks. There was barely any water in this place. And this speck made its way toward me, getting larger and larger. And finally, it turned into this guy I barely knew, a fellow lost soul. This was in southern Israel 25 years ago. And he came up to me and he said, I have oysters packed in ice. I have Belgian chocolate. And he had gotten a job dishwashing that morning at the King David Hotel and had just quit in disgust halfway through the day and had raided this super fancy 4-star hotel and just had a backpack full of this stuff. And I didn't even bother to tell him. I mean, what am I going to say, you know? I mean, sure, of course. So these kinds of things, and they're very private. You see, nothing happens there except that a guy quits his job and rips off a hotel, except that it is coincident with an internal state, a private musing of somebody else, and when the two things come together, the coincidence of it is absolutely excruciating. Kat had an experience. She's not here to tell it, but she went to Mexico when she was 19 and traveled all over Mexico and took LSD at a certain temple. And on the LSD trip in this place, she realized that she had been conceived there. And when she confronted her parents with it, it was so. It was so that she had been conceived there. Now, of course, you can say, well, in growing up, this must have been a story told around the dinner table, and then under LSD, the child brings it out. But sometimes these things just peels reality apart. The purest proof that I've ever had that goes against the clue-finding, integrative, unconscious thing, and really the time wave that we've spent so much time looking at is, in a sense, a net to trail through life. It's a coincidental engine. It causes there to be more coincidences in your life. And in fact, a way to let coincidence in your life is to let numbers into your life. The schizophrenic who looks at the license plates passing on the freeway is simply the lowest grade worshiper of numbers. But when you really let numbers into your existence, coincidence runs rampant. We have talked here a little bit about the most astonishing coincidence of all, which is that mathematics describes nature. That's a coincidence as far as I can tell. Why should it? No philosopher that I have ever read, no mathematician, has ever been able to make it make cogent sense that the abstract operations of the human mind should somehow map over the core dynamics of nature. It's like a coincidence. When I was working with the time wave, the most perfect example of anticipation or disruption of ordinary flows of probability was I had this idea when I was working out the time wave. Before the 2012 date was chosen and settled on, way back in the early 70s, I discovered an odd coincidence, which went like this. It's embedded in a whole bunch of coincidences, but it goes like this. From the date of my mother's death till the time when I met the woman who went with me to La Chorrera, 64 days passed. From the time I met that woman till the actual experiment at La Chorrera, 64 days passed. From thence forward, 3 times 64 days later was my 23rd birthday. And looking at all these coincidences, I propagated forward into time, not 64-day increments, but 384-day increments. And I discovered something really interesting, which was when you went from my 23rd birthday, 384 days forward, no particular big deal. But when you went 384 days forward again, it landed on the winter solstice of 1973. And I thought that this was mildly interesting. And so then I looked in a naval observatory almanac, and I discovered that there was a total eclipse of the sun on this solstice, which I thought was pretty weird, and that this total eclipse of the sun would sweep across the Amazon, would only be visible from the Amazon basin, would be approaching totality as it swept across La Chorrera, and it would, in fact, achieve totality over the city of Belém in Brazil. Well, now, Belém is a Portuguese word which means Bethlehem. And I began to feel led. I began to feel as though I were being fed clues. So then I looked at the map, and you may do so as well, and you will see that the city of Belém in Brazil, the city of Bethlehem, is situated in the delta of the Amazon. Well, I'm Joyce scholar and river freak enough to know that all rivers are female, and if you're too dense to know that, certainly the Amazon River is female, because it is named the Amazon. I mean, Gaia is what it is, you know, and Amazon is a giant woman. Well, here in her vulva, literally in the delta, and delta, you see, is this triangular, the Greek letter delta is a triangle and has been a schoolboy symbol for the female genitals for 18,000 years. In the delta of the Amazon sits the city of Belém, over which, on a certain winter solstice, a total eclipse of the sun will appear. And I said, you know, my goodness, this is the stuff of prophecy. Something marvelous, it must be going to happen there. And, you know, you must know Yeats' poem, what's it called? The Second Coming. The one about what rough beast slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. And it is an apocalyptic image, an image of the shift of the aeon. So I had all this data, see, pointing at December 23rd, 1973. But I got this same argument from people, this argument that you must have known, you must have seen these astronomical ephemerides at some time in the past, you must have an unconscious photographic memory, the mind must be a computer at some level, and so forth and so on. But what clinched it for me was early in 1973, still 11 months before this much anticipated moment, I opened the San Francisco Chronicle one morning, and it says, long period comet headed toward Earth. And I closed the newspaper and said aloud, I know that this comet will make its closest approach to the sun on December 23rd. Then I open the paper and read it. It says, yes, it will approach perihelion on the 22nd of December, give or take, so many hours Greenwich. And then I saw, for me, that did it. Because what it was a perfect proof. My wish had been granted. Because you see, no human being on Earth knew that this comet existed or had ever known, because it was a long period comet. It had never in historical times been in the skies of Earth. When I had focused in on this date using all these clues, it was absolutely in the value dark dimension. It was not in the collective unconscious, unless the collective unconscious anticipates the future. And if that's the case, then there's no way to contaminate any experiment from influence. So, the mushroom was willing enough to provide for my edification this thing. Well, but then see what happens. You may remember this comet. It was the comet Kohoutek. And it was an excuse for all kinds of folderol. I mean, harmonic convergence, eat your heart out. This was a much bigger deal, and yet this comet, which physically should have blossomed out into the most spectacular comet of all human history, was a dud. And once again, prophets ate it right and left, and booksellers were left with vast unsold inventory. So, to me, it's like play. It's like a joke. It's like if that doesn't seem like a joke to you, then you don't have a sense of humor. It's not going to hand over alchemical gold, because after all, why should it? Who are we to be the recipients of alchemical gold? But it does tease, and it does play. And I think if you're playful enough, you can coax it into being your playmate, and perhaps in these boundary-dissolved states, this is what happens. I've told the story about how in the Amazon, when all this stuff was breaking loose, I went through this period where very calmly and deeply and without having any need to tell anyone, I thought, I came to the opinion that I was like enlightened. And it was this very low-key thing. It was all about appropriate behavior. This was the cognitive hallucination that I was having. It was about appropriate behavior. And I had this idea there's an appropriate way to do everything. And if you do it the appropriate way, no energy will be lost. And so you become like superconducting. You become like some kind of super Tai Chi character where you just do things so niftily that there's no problem, whether it's plucking a flower or moving a boulder. And I was told, when you think, sit on the ground. There were all these teachings, and they were very simple. They were things like, sit on the ground, stupid, and, use your fingers. That was a big teaching. Use your fingers. So one of the things I was into was how you wash the pot. We had one pot. It was this little enamel pot. And we would bake it over a fire, and we baked beans, and we baked rice, and all these terrible things that would get scum on the bottom. And so it was a big deal about drawing lots for who washed the pot. Well, I discovered in my enlightened state that we had been doing it all wrong. And that if you would go down to the water with the pot and take sand and pat it very, very lightly in the bottom, and then say, please, that then all you had to do was pour water into the pot and swish it around and empty it like that. And then when you looked in, it would be like Drano, it would just be blinding white. And I did this several times, and I thought how appropriate a miracle this is. This is a real miracle. I mean, this is just simple stuff. It's totally here and now. It's absolutely Taoist. It's completely, on and on. So then I had a critic in our crowd. And so I thought that I would enlighten the critic by a wordless demonstration of my obvious command of the howling Tao. So I invited the critic to accompany me to the river. And I said, and now notice that I pick up the sand, I pat it into the bottom, I'm not agitating it. I look into the sky and I say, please. And then I put water in it and I swish it around. Voila! They said, is something supposed to happen? And I look and the crud adheres. And then this person says, I pity you. And I would pity you more, but you alarm me. This was the sequela to the thing with the dancing butterflies, which was at the same time and the same thing, which is in my enlightened state, totally master of the Tao, I would go into the woods and I would hold out my hands, my outstretched hands like this. And butterflies that I had hunted relentlessly for months with a 16-foot extendable Japanese killing machine that was my tool in trade, these canopy butterflies would come down and land on my hands and strut and show their iridescence, and tears of joy would stream down my face, and I would kneel down, and they would all line up in front of me, and then I would weep more, but, how much cathartic weeping and joy of this sort can you contain? So there would be this little nub in the experience which would begin to grow stronger, which was all about, this proves that I'm on to something. Nobody could look at this and not realize. Said, I must show someone. And the critic had not spoken to me since the pot washing incident, but was very, on me. So then I went back to camp and I said, let's just take a walk down the trail. Maybe we can work out these differences. Thinking that I wouldn't even mention it. I would just sort of, as I was consoling them, put out my hand and butterflies would drop from the trees. They would realize the error of their ways, so forth and so on. Well, of course, that didn't happen. So then I said, well, maybe I'm being too humble here. I should at least make a commitment to the thing. So I said, stand here and watch. And I raised up my hands to call the insects of the jungle to me. And then the line was delivered the second time, I pity you. And you're not your word, you're... This is all true. It is true that the butterflies danced on the back of my hand. Well, so what is one to conclude from this? Well, I think what you have to conclude is that ego is the absolute impediment to Tao. And that if you care what other people think, if you care how it's going to impact on your reputation, if you have any of these lesser concerns, this power, this radiance, this dimension of authenticity can't approach you, And we all have it. And I'm sure I have it more than most people. And yet even I am able to let down into these places where the world works magic, And I think women and intuitive men and people who aren't quite as analytical as I may be are able to do it much more. And that is the real proof. You can talk about be here now till you're blue in the face, you know, but the real proof is when nature responds like that.
Appropriate behavior.
Well, no, I don't mean caring about others. I mean that if you are, I guess the sin is pride. The sin is pride. If it thrills you that you're enlightened, or if you're glad you beat out your competition, or if you want to display your accomplishment, then it's ruined, you know? It can only be, it has to be held so very lightly, so very lightly. It cannot be shared, in a sense. Forget sharing it, because we're not pure enough to share it. It's amazing that we're pure enough to occasionally embody it, you know. I've told you the story about sitting on the beach. It always happens when you're alone, because then you get no credit. You see, it's no credit to you, and you shouldn't get any credit. But sitting on a beach, I can't even remember the substance, but something like this, or maybe something like this. I'm not sure, but sitting on a beach, meditating, holding my hands like this, and in the middle of the meditation, I become aware of something like a bug, or something is on my hand, and it's like tickling me. And so I ignore it, and then, you know, and then I come back to it, and then it feels fairly substantial. Maybe I should check this out. So then finally I open my eyes, and I look down, and there's a crab. And the crab is cleaning my fingernails. And the crab cleans all of my fingernails and then runs across my lap and cleans all of the fingernails on the other hand. Well, what this is just sitting still and letting nature be what it wants to be and letting it manifest its intentionality. We tear through and bust up and smash apart, and then we say, well, that was a nice hike in the woods, you know? And always, if you will go into the forest and sit down, and it's about finding the time of the place. And in the time of the place, the magic is coming and going in a way that if you're moving faster or slower, it just isn't there. And I've often had experiences that I felt that were connected with psychedelics, but the main function of the psychedelic was to get me to be still for a long time. Kat had a wonderful experience on a Mexican pyramid. She was exploring it. She took LSD or something and fell asleep. And when she woke up, the tree she had been sleeping in, that she had been staring into the branches before she fell asleep, and so had a very clear picture of it. When she awakened, a very large snake had shed its skin directly above her in the branches of the trees. Well, you know, part of this is the doorway into coincidence, but part of it is magical attunement with what wants to be. This is what I think Kay must have been indicating. This is not language. This is communication. This is, you know, the breath of the Tao. And everything that we say betrays this. So, feng shui, geomancy, an elaborate theory about energy flowing through the earth. As a verbal model, to me, quite unconvincing. As a set of feelings about the world, as a sense of the intentionality of place, incontrovertibly true. You know, I said earlier, maybe we lie. Maybe language is to allow us to lie. That language betrays communication. well, then we have to find our way into either silence or gesture or dance or song, some way of unbridling the horse we ride so that it can take us where it wants to go, which is back into this place where ego isn't grabbing. Because you see, it must be so that if the magic retreats from each one of us in the wilderness, how much more then it must retreat from us as a community, en masse, as a planetary species. So we live in a domain of triviality that we have created. You know, we have trivialized the world. The elves, the fairies, the water sprites, the energies that flow in the earth with the seasons, the movement of the stars, the machinery of being, the drama of life and death. We push all this away and we hold ourselves above it. I mean, death is sanitized, birth is sanitized, everything is made less authentic, as though we are somehow threatened by the authenticity of being. Why are we threatened by the authenticity of being? Why does it take such tremendously powerful hallucinogenic agents to put us where we should be operating in terms of our pattern of caring for the world and for each other? And this is a real question, I think. It goes hand in hand with the question that I think is very worthwhile for the group to try and deal with, which is, if psychedelics are so wonderful, are we better people? And if they are wonderful and we're not better people, then why not? What precisely is our relationship to people who know nothing of this? Is this a way? Is it the way? Is it no way at all? How does the mystical vision feed back into how we are with and for each other? Are we doing enough with that? Are we, do we exemplify enough what we know and what we feel? And if we don't, how can we? Because this is our faith. I believe that we have something precious that we want to give to those who are operating without awareness of it. But before you give something away, you have to wonder after the consequences. I don't have answers to this. I mean, this is the question that should hover over our lives. Do we embody the radiant correctness of what we say we are pursuing? I certainly feel that I am a flawed and fragile vessel for this. I mean, my strength is my ordinariness. It must be. It's the only suit I can play. So that must have been the idea, that it would be Joe anybody. But how can we make it live for ourselves? And this is a problem with the evolution of language, the evolution of communication, of caring, of intent, and then of implementing the vision. I don't know, maybe I'm impatient. Maybe it's happening. And maybe the awareness of the changing earth, the awareness of the needs of the earth, the awareness of the needs of women, the awareness of social injustice generally, is all part of this thing. I had a very satisfying experience recently. A guy, a publisher, an editor, came to see Kat and I from Australia. And we talked about all this stuff, and he was a fellow psychedelico. And he said, nobody had ever said this to me before, he said, from where I'm sitting, I think that you're winning. And by your winning, What he meant was that inch by inch by inch, the dream is actually gaining ground. There will be a second hearing. There will be an appeal from the absolute judgments of 20 years ago. Well, then in that case, it devolves upon all of us to embody this thing and to not cut corners and to you know, as it says in the Grateful Dead song, try just a little bit harder, just a little bit more. And I think doing that, and a lot of it is a letting go. It's not a pushing into, it's a letting go. Then the magic draws close. I mean, nature loves courage. You've heard me say this. The way nature shows her love of courage is by removing obstacles. That's how the shaman can dance in the waterfall. He can't dance in the waterfall except that he's so damn courageous that God suspends the laws of physics in the face of such faith. You know, it's something like that. It's the courage to be. The courage to be. To be is to dance in the waterfall. And I'm really not, if it sounds like I'm berating you, I'm not. I'm speaking, you're serving as a screen for my own psychotherapeutic process, because I clutch at many levels. But fortunately, and thank God, you know, there were enough instances of recklessness and sheer error and pure madness and peer pressure and all of these things that I got a taste. And I think you all have a taste. That's what unites us in trying to run this thing to ground. And it's the heart of it that is so hard to talk about. I mean, I skim the ideas off the depth of a sea of heart whose boundaries cannot be taken, because that's my style. But the unsaid part, the dizziness of the things unsaid. Remember the poem by Trumbull Stickney? I lean over your meaning's edge, and I feel the dizziness of the things you have not said. And the dizziness of the things unsaid, for us fans of dizziness, is ecstasy, the vertigo. Weren't we first spun in the schoolyard? Wasn't that your first altered state of consciousness? To be spun and spun until you fall down and watch the world move around? It's the dizziness of the things unsaid. That's a real problem for me. I'm a sayer. But it's worth invoking it, if only to let it resonate in the silence. Well, there are different things here. There's a lot of good in psychedelics that is not what I've been talking about today. A lot of people are hurting. A lot of people have traumatic past histories. A lot of people need to be, you know, unplugged, cleaned out, straightened out. I see the psychedelic experience as a birthright, and we can't have a free society until people are free to explore their own minds. It's so obvious. So, you know, I'm as against restricting access to drugs as I am to burning books. It offends me in the same way. People must be free. We are the measure of the political universe, not the state, not the race. These have all been tried with horrible results. Individual human beings must be free. Anything which ameliorates that has to be looked at very, very carefully. Sexuality. and the restriction of information access and understanding that revolved around that issue for the past 500 years just shows me that we don't want to go into that with the mind. Because anything can be taboo. Your genitals don't have to be taboo. Your mind could be taboo. Anything could be taboo. But the presence of the taboo is so destructive and alienating, and so makes community so impossible that we have to take individual men and women and we have to make them free. That is the system where freedom has to be maximized. I don't say that we have to convert these people to the existence of magic. In fact, we don't have to convert them to anything. The nature of the beast, meaning the nature of these hallucinogens, will set the agenda once we are free to inquire. That's all. Freedom of inquiry. Well, on one level, you're right. The laws are totally irrelevant. We ignore them. So does everyone else. You mean we worry about them? Styles of taking and styles of getting together. Yeah. Well, this is like the same question about sexuality or automobiles or anything. Obviously, though we say all people are created equal, we don't sell guns to 8-year-olds and this sort of thing. But within the context of reasonable people attempting to reach reasonable positions, I think this should be as free as possible. I think there should be an institution for handling it. You see, if we were a primitive or a pre-literate society, there would be shamans who would be professionals, and they would take out the adolescent boys and the adolescent girls and put them through ceremonies that would inculcate them into the secret life and belief systems of the tribe, and then certain ones would be selected out to be the shamans of the next generation. We don't have any kind of institution like that. Part of my motivation for a public career is the belief that psychotherapy could be this. The motivation behind psychotherapy is entirely correct. But how can we make it real, you know? Shamanism does this. You see, I wouldn't go to a shaman for a cure if I had carcinoma or something like that. I regard them as most effective in the realm of mental problems, psychological conditions. This is why when ethnobotany got started, the first things that are looked at are the psychoactive plants. Because if a shaman tells you this will cause you to see visions, he's probably correct. But if he tells you this will cure a disease, this is less certainly so, because the concept of curing disease is a more Western notion. The concept of restoring neurotic imbalance seems to be pretty generalized worldwide. I think that if you're interested in drugs, the first stop is the library, and it's a long stop, and you educate yourself. This all seems very natural to me. This is how I did it, and how all my friends did it. In the early 1960s, there were articles in newspapers about morning glory seeds and this kind of thing. We followed up and learned how to use scientific literature to figure out dosages and all of this kind of thing. For me, I mean, I take drugs seriously. So I also don't want, I'm perfectly aware of their capacity to cause a problem. So you want to be educated. You want to have all the information. So people, number one, have to be educated. And then they have to be given the freedom to decide. Now, inevitably, certain people will evolve pathological lifestyles of addiction, dependency, and abuse. But those people usually can evolve these lifestyles there are perfectly legal avenues to evolve these lifestyles. I mean, alcohol is obviously more conducive to these maladaptive lifestyles than almost anything else. If I were totally juiced, you could tell it. If I were a lifelong junkie and I had just shot, I could deliver this lecture. It wouldn't trigger any awareness in you. So the debilitating, damaging, maladaptive drugs are all legal. And what is restricted then is stuff which gives you funny ideas. That's the problem, the funny ideas category. Well, put that way, it doesn't take long to see why. Because funny ideas are very problematic for institutions. On the other hand, funny ideas are the life breath of creativity. So who are we going to make comfortable? A bunch of control freaks? See, I think it was really a mistake in the 60s to try and take society away from the people who want to run it, to wage revolution with psychedelic drugs, where I don't know if those people realized, but their weapon was effective enough that the world's first nuclear power was quaking in its boots, because you could produce 10, 20, 40 million hits of LSD. Well, so that's terrifying to an establishment, because what if you changed 20, 60, 40 million minds? But if it can be kept in a human scale, where you say out in California, people hang out at Esalen and then they take off their clothes and then they meditate and then a few of them go on to drugs. This doesn't threaten anybody. The way in which LSD was used to thumb noses at the establishment brought trouble. It, I don't think, should have been seen as a direct tool of social and political action. It should have been handled as an adjunct to creativity. Its agenda would have surfaced. We would have ended up in a better place. This is what Aldous Huxley wanted to do, you know. He felt that you go to the people, to the power freaks, in a non-threatening way. You don't say to them, hey, Mr. Dean, hey, Mr. President, 100,000 acid heads have surrounded your administration building, and if you don't accede to these 15 non-negotiable demands, we're going to pull the place apart. But no, you send his friend that he went to Yale with to him, who says, you know, a few of us have been getting together and there's really this extraordinary thing happening and we think you should be brought in on this. This is going to be tremendous. But it polarized. I find it hard to understand. I mean, I like Leary very much, and Metzner is a close personal friend of mine, but I'm now 42 years old. I'm the age Leary was when he was fired from Harvard. If I were fired from Esalen, so to speak, my response would not to be a tour of the major campuses of America to set the troops marching and sending the checks home to mom and dad. I'm delighted that people 16 to 25 are interested in what I have to say, but I don't see myself as the Pope of the Children's Crusade. It's not like that at all. We need to reach creative people in all levels of society and in all positions of power. Creative people will respond to this. It is, after all, a personal thing. It's a personal thing. The revolution that wanted to give everybody LSD also wanted to have sex in the streets. This was a banner. I've shouted it myself through the streets. But hey, is that going to do a lot for relationships? To have an orgy at the corner of Bancroft and Telegraph? Will this make us all better able to relate to our significant other? I'm not sure. So I think a lighter touch. What was also absent in the 60s was any awareness of tradition. People thought that LSD came from God via Albert Hoffman. They didn't realize that shamanism was about this. They didn't realize that that there was a huge body of evidence that they could call on to support their position, which was, this is what religion really was about for the first million years, and this is what ecstasy was about before it became about, silent prayer and abstention and rejection of the senses and all of this stuff. So that really, I think, was the revolution and contribution of the 70s, the anthropological angle. I mean, it's pretty startling to read 1970s or 1960s LSD literature that has not been edited or amended since. If you want to look at this, take a look at Stephen Gaskin's book, Amazing Dope Tales. The book was published in 1969, so it's completely uncontaminated by the shifts in consciousness of the 70s and the 80s. Well, it's an astonishingly unspiritual book. What people seemed to do on LSD back in the Haight-Ashbury, a lot of them, was what was called power tripping and ego tripping. And people played games with other people who were on it. Power games, sex games, control games. And there wasn't a sense of the sacred dimension. All the metaphors are drawn from the transcendent realms of Mahayana Buddhism. Enlightenment, bardo, nirvana, white light, ego death. A lot about ego death. I barely ever hear that pass my lips. I mean, I talk about diminishing the ego, but I don't conceive it as a dissolving into whiteness. I conceive it as a coming to terms with the world that wants to be recognized all around us. So we have evolved the language. We have created dimensions for the experience that we didn't have before. And I think we still are. I mean, LSD was a love drug, but it was a kind of collective. You loved your tribe. You loved your affinity group. Mushrooms brought in this connection to nature. And mushrooms were not available. Psilocybin was rare as hen's teeth until 1975. I mean, I know because I sought it, and my brother and I wrote the book that we did specifically so that people could have mushrooms. And I know who our competitors were and when those publication dates were, and it just did not exist unless you were very close to the, inner high mucky mucks of psychedelica. I only once took something which was said to be synthetic psilocybin, because I didn't know anybody. I was a spear carrier back in the golden age. And what the mushrooms brought in was, for a lot of people, access to hallucinations. LSD is quite mental. You have to be of a certain inner constitution, or you have to take a lot to have hallucinations. And then the hallucinations are of a certain character. Psilocybin, by being visibly from the earth, and by having this tremendous synergistic effect on the vision-producing part of the brain, empowered the extraterrestrial rap, the fairies. That was not seriously part of the LSD phenomenon, and so forth. So I think, it evolves in time. We are filling in the pieces, and there are probably dimensions yet to come that we all will be involved in. I mean, I assume many of you will end up psychotherapists, educators, writers, people who will make an impact on society through ideas and through the teaching and the imposition of methods. And so this has to be part of the armamentarium, because it is so salutary to all our concerns. I don't know that they do. You might ask Angie Arian. She's the resident authority on the Basques. I know they're into something called the light work, and I know they're herders from way back, shepherds, people who follow cattle. Probably were into all of this stuff very early. Maria Sabina, the great mushroom shamaness of Huatla, always claimed that she really had never been taught about the mushrooms, that she discovered as a girl, hungry for food. She was left to tend the cattle, and she experimented with these things. It's certainly generally conceded that astrology, astronomy, observation of the stars was something that shepherds were the first people to pay attention to, because they stayed up all night and watched their flocks and observed the horizon. This connection with domesticated animals, whether the Basques today use psychedelic plants, I couldn't say. Most Europeans don't, and the history of Europe is poor in instances of psychedelic use because the flora of Europe is poor. There are daturas, and there's henbane and monkshood and opium brought in and hashish, but it's not a psychedelic ecosystem at all. Well, it clearly isn't the only path. It may be the only path to a certain place, but if that's not the place you want to go, then you would follow a different path. They bring you to the discovery that everything you know is wrong, period. If you are not interested in having that experience, and many people aren't, many people, when they get to the goal of drugs, say, okay, that's it. I'm finished with drugs. Now I know. I didn't need to know that, and I'm sorry I found out. You have to have a taste for the weird, the bizarre, the outre, the beyond. It's an edge phenomenon. It's a 12th house phenomenon. It's a scorpionic kind of thing. The other objection that you raise, that it's artificial, well, I agree in some sense, in that I don't like synthetic drugs, but the banner under which the entire new paradigm is operating is that it is an illusion that there is an inside and an outside. It is an illusion that there is a self and world. So we cannot, if you believe that it's artificial, you already are deeply committed to a dualistic view of the place of the person in the world. It's the ordinary view that people are distinct from the world. There may be philosophical churches here that can't be reconciled. I'm basically some kind of a phenomenologist. When you begin to analyze perception, it can be analyzed different ways. My analysis leads me to think that the distinction between real and unreal is a misunderstanding, and that in fact all these distinctions between self and world, between real and unreal, between inner and outer, these are in fact the very boundaries that it dissolves. So it will change you a lot then to dissolve those boundaries, because they will then be seen by you as merely opinions rather than discoveries about how the world really is. Psychedelics don't say how the world really is. They say how the world really isn't. That's what they always do, is they negate. They say, no, it isn't that, and it isn't that, and it isn't even that. So they're not offering a kind of replacement faith. It's really a religion of doubt. This is what drives people crazy. They say, well, you don't believe in anything. Damn right. It wasn't easy to get to this place of not believing in anything. But it's not an existential abandonment. It's not like, I don't believe in anything. It's that in order to be free, I must not believe anything. Then all things can be freely commanded in the mind. And that's what psychedelics show. They say everything you think is wrong, even what you think now is wrong. Therefore, even your most advanced thoughts are provisional. Therefore, if you like thinking, think, but don't think that thinking is somehow important. It really isn't. But it's hard to learn that. And the only way I've been able to learn it, I am, like a cured alcoholic, except I'm a cured materialist. I thought that I could prove the correctness of materialism by taking drugs. And then I would see that all these people were wrong about the power of drugs. They were just soft heads. And I would survive the experience and keep my skepticism intact. But what did I know? It was quicksand, and now I'm what I am because I got in over my head. Your attitude is the correct attitude until reality makes it impossible to have that opinion any longer. I mean, that's the reasonable, anybody should have that attitude until reality forces them to think something else. I mean, I would much rather have that attitude than the attitude that, Babaji is God, or, because I perform this particular ritual in this particular constellation, I don't have to be a decent human being. But experience, this is the appalling thing about these drugs. They are forms of experience. And that's all you can have. People who choose to go through life without the experience will form a set of impressions about reality based on the lack of that particular data. We can't all know everything about everything or all go everywhere. So the only reasonable position in a spiritual quest which revolves around experiences is to be true to yourself. Be true to yourself. Try to think as clearly as possible. Try to transcend limitations, and then see where it gets you. And the other thing is, of course, you spoke of drugs, and I replied to your objection in terms of drugs, but there are all kinds of drugs that I wouldn't take on a bet. And there are all kinds of experiences that you can assure me will be good for me, and I will still perversely avoid them because I don't want those experiences. I know already. Well, the drugs that I'm advocating, their greatest enthusiasts do them least often because it's so appalling. I mean, it is not recreation. I mean, you may call it recreation, but when you actually approach the big ones, your heart pounds, your palms sweat. You wish you'd chosen back at the ashram or something. No, I don't advocate living in a haze of drug-induced perception. I may, but I don't advocate it. And the big ones, it takes months to assimilate a large psychedelic trip. No, the purpose is to enrich the here and now, to enrich the down state, because this is where we live, after all. I mean, this is where we live. And also, it might as well be said, people who take drugs all the time are getting the wrong effect. I mean, your system just adapts. Everything becomes like caffeine after a while. It either becomes like caffeine or it becomes like opium. It either puts you to sleep or it wires you up. So it's about doing it with attention and in a ritual setting and at high enough doses that you get somewhere. I mean, I think the worst thing you can do is diddle with low doses. The nibblers of this world are no friends of mine, It should be overwhelming, and it should be an act of courage. What I've said in other situations like this is, if you're not afraid, then you're not doing either the right drug or enough of the right drug. If in the privacy of your own mind you're not afraid, then you're just probably out for a good time. And I have nothing against having a good time, but I actually like having a good time without drugs, because when I have a drug going, I feel an obligation to go to work. Think, look, understand. Well, this is why we might question the wisdom of uniting the idea of psychedelic exploration with late adolescence. Is that a good idea? To take people 16 to 25 who are trying to come to terms with being independent in the world, defining their sexuality, leaving their parents' home and getting a life for themselves, and then we add on, oh yes, and there's one more thing, you have to put up with this. I don't know. I think people pretty much have to self-select. Since we cannot legally organize. See, if we could legally organize, there would be a network of shamans who would be sitters, who when someone wanted to do a certain drug, they would say, well, who sits good? Who sits well for this? And then you would go, and that person would train you in whatever they had to teach, which would be diet, breath control, postures, mudras, dances, rituals. They would train you, and the last thing that they would bring onto the scene would be the hallucinogen. Our situation is different and a real problem. This is why we have to hold meetings like this. We're like somebody walking along a beach who comes upon a sailboat and decides they're going to learn to sail. Well, can they learn to sail before they sink the boat? That's the question. And it's going to depend on how smart they are to begin with, how the weather is that day, how the tides are that day. They may not. We're trying to do the most difficult of all things, which is bootstrap ourselves, none of us knowing any more than any of the rest of us, bootstrap ourselves to a new level of talking about this. What we have to do, I think, in this situation is each of us tell our story. Somebody thought it was wonderful. Somebody thought it was terrible. Each tell our story and then try to create a set of techniques out of that works. This is what I've been doing for 25 years. I mean, when we first got together, my peers at Cal, all we did, I mean, we took drugs a lot, but what we really did was we talked about it an awful lot. What is it? Trying to understand it, trying to compete with each other for the metaphors that would encapsulate it. And out of this has come a very grassroots kind of consensus, I think, which unites ideas like shamanism, an invisible world, the importance of holding down ego, the importance of paying attention, that nature is somehow a friend and an ally. We're putting it together ourselves. It isn't a science, it's an art. Shamanism is an art. And we take what we can get from all of these other traditions. Maybe we're doing better than we think. You know, I mean, I've had the experience in the Amazon of talking with a shaman, and we're talking about something, how he uses a certain plant or something. And then I would say, well, you know, the so-and-so tribe, they know this plant and they use it in the following way. And then the guy would say, well, how do you know that? That's amazing. Well, I know it because I read Harvard Museum botanical leaflets where this anthropological data is deployed. So while we don't have a grizzled old master shaman hung with bones and beads to guide us through, what we do have is a huge amount of ethnographic data and material collected in all parts of the world about how people on all kinds of levels of culture, but many of them pre-literate, handle these problems. So what we have is a kind of generic shamanism. And if we can infuse it with life, it will probably work for us. I'm very happy to see that the ayahuasca is coming up out of the Amazon, and that people are trying to form circles. They're trying to do it right. One reason they're trying to do it right is because there is so little of this that you have to convince somebody that you're worthy before you even get invited. So it's not something that is just handed out to everyone. But if we could create a generic shamanism that we could infuse with life, I think we could probably create a series of interlocking institutions and rituals that would make this more accessible to other people. I have great admiration for the sitters, for the guides. I mean, I won't do that. I worry too much. I'm too susceptible to the transference. I am so empathetic with people on high doses of these things that I can't stand to be around them. But it's a different calling. So I don't consider myself a shaman. I'm more like, court jester and village bard. But The shaman is the person who will actually give you the techniques, whatever they may be, whether they're substances or rituals, give you the techniques to carry you into the place. It's difficult what we're trying to do because we were robbed a long time ago of this birthright. This is different than recreating a dance or a sweat lodge or something like that, because this is all in the mind and in the heart. Yeah.
Where this can go.
You're right, we're hoist on our own petard. Well, nobody said that knowledge is, that the pursuit of knowledge is not a dangerous path. I mean, I'm not sure that it can be entirely sanitized. And there's something else to be said about all this. I say we have to create these shamanic forms ourselves. We have to bootstrap ourselves to a generic shamanism. But in fact, we have the most powerful ally which the traditional shamans had, and that is the plants. The plants teach. Fundamentally, shamanism is a one-to-one relationship between a person and a plant. And if you know what I mean, you know what I mean. If you don't, it just sounds like somebody's advocating that you talk to lettuces. But I didn't believe it myself until I got into the domain where it was happening. Nature wants to communicate. She wants us to pick up the telephone. She wants us to direct our attention toward the idea that nature can present itself as real communication. If we could let down into that, then the crab that cleans our fingernails, or the snake that sheds its skin above us in the tree, these things then become the teacher. I mean, this is what the mushroom says. He says, you don't need the teacher, I am the teacher. And it is but for you to recognize and come to terms with that. It's not a tough row to hoe, and maybe it's not for everybody, and maybe we are misguided to seek to expand our circle larger. I mean, maybe what we should seek to do is to deepen the experience and connections within our circle. This is another way to do it. You know, human beings don't believe in anything unless it's a mass movement. But when it's something from the heart, maybe the real authentication of it comes from a deeper personal commitment. Well, why don't we knock off for today? The first thing I wanted to talk about was because the summer solstice is a great pagan celebration, and because I think we self-consciously celebrate it with the sense that we are participating in something which goes slightly against the grain of the dominator culture in which we're embedded, and because that culture has made a paragon of reason, I thought it might be fun tonight to just talk a little bit about reason and intuition and the forms and the politics that attend each. So let me dig into this a little and think aloud. Reason, which is always held up as the path to true understanding, has two forms. They are called deduction and induction, and all forms of reason can be subsumed under these two types. Now, deduction, which is considered the stronger form of reason, is called reasoning from first principles, and it works like this. You start from an idea which cannot be proven. You accept it as given, and you reason outward from it. An example that is familiar to all of us would be Euclid's elements of plane geometry. You start with what appears to be an incontrovertible truth, or what we agree appears to be an incontrovertible truth. In the case of Euclid, propositions such as parallel lines never cross, never meet. Well, you can imagine a railroad in your head and run your mind along it to infinity, and then you've inspected the infinite railroad, and lo and behold, at no point did the rails cross. So you accept this as true. Then you can reason from it. Now, in the case of the Euclidean proposition that parallel lines don't meet, you test the truth of it by carrying out this imaginary inspection of the items involved and verifying that the statement appears true in all cases that you can imagine. But other branches of human knowledge also use deduction. Interestingly enough, theology. So theology reasons like in the following manner. God exists. This is perhaps not Christian theology, this is a generic theology. God exists, because Christian theology would seek to go further back and prove, in some cases, such as in scholasticism, that God exists. But let's just start with the given assumption that God exists, and then a second assumption, and God loves us. Given these two assumptions, then deduction goes to work and elaborates an explanation for why we are not with God, how we can get to God, and so forth and so on. So deduction is useful. Notice that my two examples have been drawn from, in the case of Euclid, mathematics, in the case of the second case from theology, a branch of philosophy. So deduction seems to have an important role in these abstract systems. But remember, I said it was one of two forms of reasoning that are ordinarily dealt with. Now, the second form of reasoning is, to my mind, more interesting. The second form of reasoning is induction, not deduction, induction. And induction, for those who believe in it, is thought to be, without doubt, a superior form of reasoning to deduction, because it leads to a control and a manipulation of real consequences in the world. Okay, what is induction, and how it works, and how does it work? Well, it works like this. When I hit the water with a shovel, it makes a splash. Every time I hit the water with the shovel, it makes a splash. Therefore, this is the leap, the therefore, shovels can be used to make water splash. Now, notice what is interesting about this in contrast to deduction is that there is no untested first principle. You don't state something and then reason from it. You make repetitious observations, and then those observations which are most repetitious you raise to the status of laws. Induction. And this was abhorrent to philosophical thinkers, because it doesn't have this Aristotelian purity that deduction has. It doesn't have this mathematical elegance. It's messy. It's all down in the world, observing and comparing and repeating experimentally procedures. But nevertheless, out of inductive reasoning comes the structure of modern science. Okay. But now there's a funny thing about induction. It's making an unstated assumption about time. It is making the assumption that time is invariant. Because what it is saying is, if A precedes B in 1,000 cases, then it is likely that A will precede B in the 1,001st case. In other words, it's a probabilistic theory. It assumes that probabilistic laws give momentum to repetitious observation. Now the question is this so? And the answer is, well, it's so in some cases, but not in the most interesting cases. The most interesting cases, I believe, are the cases which lie in the realm of primary experience of being, the felt experience of being. And in that realm, the realm of love affairs, divorces, lawsuits, religions, political upheavals, and that sort of thing, induction is no good guide at all. One love affair does not explain another. One marriage does not illuminate another. One revolution really does not shed light on another. There may be generalizations, but when you live through these things, what you take from them is the uniqueness of the experience. The first principles that are reasoned from in deduction, whether in the realm of a deductive mathematical system like Euclid or a rational theology, these things are seen to rest on foundations of sand because of this problem of the axiom. In mathematics, the axiom appears fairly secure because it's self-evident, such as parallel lines never meet. It rests on its self-evidence to make its appeal to reason. You see, you can see that it is true, though no one has ever figured out how to prove this. You can see that it is true. But when you move from the realm of axioms to the realm of theological first principles, the appeal then is not at all to the obviousness of it, but to the desirability of it, that God exists, that God loves us. We hope these things are true, but they are certainly not self-evident in the scheme of things from the point of view of most of us. So what this shows then, I think, is that in the matter of deeper things, deductive reasoning rests only on the appeal that hope can lend to its case. Okay, so for me, this is a critique of deduction. Now, what about induction? I referred to the fact that its premises rest on this notion of temporal invariance, which seems to be true only for the grossest of phenomena. Science has made great hay in that dimension by creating laws which are essentially predictive laws of cyclical phenomena that define for us what part of reality goes around and comes around. In other words, we can predict simple phenomena involving the mechanical orbits in gravitational fields. We can make simple predictions about the end results of certain chemical processes, certain nuclear processes, so forth and so on. But when you lay it against the background of nature and experience, it begins to look like pretty thin soup. It's no basis for claiming epistemic preeminence. And this is the point that I want to make. Science claims epistemic preeminence. That means that science doesn't say, we are an ideology like Buddhism and Taoism and the Tarot. They say, we are a metasystem. We shall judge all other systems in our scales. Well, this is politics, but not good philosophy. because there is no basis for this claim to epistemic preeminence. So this somewhat egghead rave is supposed to pass for a pagan polemic on the summer solstice, because it's an attack on the foundations of reason itself. And as you know, when reason goes, barbarism and madness cannot be far behind. And as a self-declared philosophical anarchist, as in fact the founding member of the Henri Poincaré Anarchist International, our motto is "Chaos is order." I believe that it's entirely appropriate to carry out an attack on reason. Okay, so then what are we left with? Well, what we're left with is intuition. Intuition. And what is it and how does it work? Well, it's a feeling into things that comes to answers and leaves no trail. That's the thing. It leaves no trail. So you have it, but you haven't the argument for it. And so its power must reside in its truthfulness. So the power of intuition lies in its ability to express truth in contravention to the forward flow of logic and casuistry. Well, is it always to be this, you know how the Tao is presented as this Eastern concept that you can barely wrap your mind around and that hovers at the edge of intelligibility? Well, really, in these so-called obscure Oriental philosophical stances always turn out to have a corollary in Western thinking, and the corollary to the Tao, to Taoism, is intuitionalism, is, you know, an ability to sense the constraints and opportunities in the moment and act through it. Intuition. And intuition is always presented in the dominator society as 1, vague, 2, feminine, 3, unreliable. But this is simply because of this bias toward deductive and inductive systems whose falsity I have just demonstrated to you. In fact, in the felt domain of experience called living, intuition is how most of us, even the most self-defined as non-intuitional, are operating. Intuition is a kind of field processing of both the foreground and the background of experience. It's a gestalt understanding that is subliminal and that leads the whole organism through an invisible set of creodes towards the maximizing of some kind of a goal. Okay, end of Act 1. The second act opens in the middle of the 19th century with science responding, albeit unconsciously, to an understanding of what I've just said. The inadequacy of reason, the necessity of intuition, and yet all this going on in a domain of Victorian gentlemen with beards to their belts and a world where pianos wore pants. So, you know, it worked its way out subtly in the notion of evolution. And evolution is a very interesting concept that even those of us who profess to believe in it, I think, don't fully grasp, what comes in this package. We all are taught that in the 19th century, a great struggle was waged between science and religion because science had the audacity to suggest that human beings were descended from the great apes. and we all know who took what sides and the kind of polemics that were raised, and we all know the happy ending of this story with the great triumph of modern evolutionary biology. However, that, to my mind, looking at it from the point of view of a philosopher, is all sham, or it's like the 11 o'clock news version of what actually happened. That's how rather silly people understood the great intellectual watershed struggle of the 19th century. That is not, in fact, what it was about. That's not what it was about. The outrageous assertion of the evolutionists, of Darwin particularly, and his school, was not that human beings were descended from the great apes. In fact, the outrageous assertion wasn't even contained in the part of the manuscript that was called The Descent of Man. You recall it was called The Origin of Species and the Descent of Man, and where the real kicker was lodged was in The Origin of Species. Why? Because Darwin set out to show that nature could be the product of processes without purpose. That was the bit that brought the roof down. Ordinary people couldn't understand this. This is called the so-called teleological issue. But this is what brought the Christian church roaring to its feet in confrontation with evolutionary biology. The assertion that nature could be accounted for by processes that were not guided toward a higher end by a higher power, that simply random molecular processes and then pressures of environmental selection could cause to come to be animals, plants, and ultimately human beings. But the fight was over teleology. The fight was over whether or not the universe has a purpose toward which all creation moves ineluctably, or whether nature is what the Darwinists called it, which was trendlessly fluctuating. Trendlessly fluctuating. So it was an attack on God, not the divinity, not the divine status of man. That was peanuts in this poker game. It was an attack on the need for God per se as an efficient cause in the machinery of universal being. Well, it's a very interesting question and a very interesting struggle because we are still caught up in it. American transcendentalism, while all this was going on in England, American transcendentalism was exploring the transcendental realms of the human spirit cast against the background of the American landscape. And this question of the telos in nature was, to make friends, lifelong friends, into enemies and sunder families. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of evolution with Darwin, really preceded him. He had a fever. He was a professional butterfly collector, as I was once in my youth. And on the island of Ternate in eastern Indonesia, Wallace fell into a malarial fever. And at the height of this fever, he wrote down a page and a half of scribbling, which when he came down from this illness and read it, it seemed to hold up. And what he had discovered was what all biology was seeking, what he called the solution to the problem of the species. And he looked at this thing, and what it was a description of natural selection. And it seemed to work. Well, Wallace was from the lower classes, had made his living in England as a surveyor, was essentially a field biologist because he was not accepted by the gentleman scientists of England. He didn't know where to turn, so he fired off a letter to the only person he could think of to ask, who was the greatest biologist of the day, Charles Darwin, at home in England in his garden, working over 20 years of notes on the problem of the species. When Darwin got this letter from this unknown character, postmarked Ambon, Dutch East Indies, and read it, he paled visibly. And he went to his friend, Sir Charles Lyell, who was the greatest geologist of the day, the proponent of catastrophism, and was to develop into one of the great defenders of Darwin's theory. He went to Charles Lyell and said, I've been working 20 years on this idea. This came in the post. This is it. It's all here. And Lyell said, don't worry, my friend. We will schedule 2 papers to be delivered at the Royal Society. They will be delivered on the same evening, and yours shall be first. And so it was. And so it comes down to us as Darwin's theory of evolution. But in fact, in a way, for philosophical purists, it may have been better that way, because Wallace, who was in many ways a deeper thinker than Darwin, was a Fabian socialist, was fascinated by paranormal phenomena, as well as being interested in electricity, biogeography, anthropology, truly one of the last of the great polymaths. Wallace was unable to take the final step on the question of teleology. And he said, I cannot believe that random processes ameliorated by natural selection can give rise to a creature such as man. So this was the break in the 19th century, and it arises out of the earlier foundation of the struggle between intuition and reason. I mean, I think our intuition must place us in Wallace's camp, that there is a telos of some sort. There is an omega point toward which all creation, however unsteadily, moves. And it is because of this omega point that we do live in a cosmos and not a chaos, not simply a raging confusion, but something that is structured and ordered. Well, in spite of the fact that evolution was seeking to serve the most rigorous scientific desires to exclude teleology and to exclude God from the process of the natural world, it introduced a bizarre concept which cut against its own purposes. The concept is a kind of progress in nature where previously none had been. So that from Aristotle to the 19th century, what you have as a theory of nature is what's called the great chain of being, or the great ladder of being. And it stretches from God through the archangels, the seraphim, the cherubim, down man, then the animal kingdom, the vegetable kingdom, so forth and so on. But it is imagined as static, as put in place by the fiat lux of creation, set in place for all time. What Darwin did was to see it as not a great chain of being, but as an escalator of being. He added the notion of progressive movement toward higher and higher forms, more and more complex manifestations of the intrinsic ingression of novelty into actual events. And this idea is very, very interesting and cogent and pregnant with possibility for all of us and our world. You see, what it is really is it's a recasting of an idea that had been banished for several centuries from Western thinking. It is the alchemical idea that nature is driving to perfect itself. This was what the alchemists believed. They believed that through time, lesser metals became gold, and that what the alchemist was trying to do was to compress time. He was trying to catalyze a natural process so that what took thousands, in their imagination, of years in the body of the earth could be compressed into days or weeks in the alembic of the alchemists. Well, as science defined itself throughout the 17th and 18th century under the impetus of Descartes and Kant and all of these people, this notion of the world as a distillate apparatus was given up. But it returns in the idea of evolution, and we inherit it in the social world. Now, this is a delicate point. There is something called social Darwinism, otherwise known as fascism. Social Darwinism uses a very vulgar understanding of evolutionary dynamics to justify class oppression by saying that it must be right that some people have their foot on other people's necks, because isn't this what nature is about? Struggle of the fittest and survival of the longest fang, the swiftest claw, the sharpest tooth. Well, the answer is no, absolutely not. This rests on an understanding of nature that was in vogue 150 years ago, that is not in vogue now. That's what you see when you look at nature in the human dimension. But when you analyze nature as an integrated system of chemical reactions, gene transfer, catalytic self-regulating activities, hypercycles of energy, nutrients, and metabolism, when you analyze nature from that point of view, you see that it seeks to maximize cooperation, connectedness, mutual interdependability is the thing which holds the whole thing together. And the species that is most successful is not the species that can dominate all others. It's the species that can make itself indispensable to all others. Look at the evolutionary success of the bacteria. You know, they settled in for the long haul, and no higher form of life can operate without them. And so the possibility of bacteria becoming extinct is laughable. I mean, they'll be the last to go because they have made themselves indispensable. This idea then of evolution has strongly entered the human world, and science hates this. I had somebody once say to me, if it doesn't involve genes, it ain't evolution. And you should not use the word evolution to describe progressive change. They didn't like that. They said evolution is a technical term used by biologists, and it applies to genetic material only. Books do not evolve, social systems do not evolve, corporations, relationships do not evolve. This is a misuse of the word. Well, since then, evolutionary thinkers like C.H. Waddington, Eric Jantsch, Wes Churchman, Paul Feyerabend, Irvin Laszlo have, I think by the sheer force and volume of their writings overwhelmed this notion and reclaimed evolution as a much broader concept than it was understood to be in the 19th century. Evolution is now understood to be the triumphant march out of chaos into order, connectedness, self-expression, and self-reflection that begins with the first moments following the Big Bang. In other words, we have we have atomic evolution, evolution of atomic systems as electrons settle down into stable orbits. We have chemical evolution into more and more complex molecular forms, which finally become polymers. These polymers further evolve into complex intergetic systems capable of self-replication, motility, and eventually, the writing of operas. So what we see when we look at the universe is that you have to be blind to this progressive tendency that has worked its will with the random plasma of pure electrons, with the chemistry of stars, with the molecular chemistry of primitive planets, with plant and animal life, with human epigenetic coding systems, carving, dance, ritual, vocalization, magic, and this process proceeds right up into the 20th century with this phenomenon that we all give some credence to, the notion that we are living in a period of compressed time. Well, so what are we to do with that? I think what we have to do is begin then to design this process. It is now moving fast enough that it is within the ken of each one of us to see progressive consolidation of change taking place in the world around us. We as human beings, I think, are destined to be the design and control element in this thing, in this global Gaian process. Never mind that we have done it so badly up to now, because now, meaning the 20th century, is a completely different kind of epistemic world than any world that preceded it. And to the degree that we can shed the inherited behavior patterns of previous centuries, previous cultural styles, and actually take hold of the tools present at hand, we can guide and control this evolutionary process. Culture, as it is in a sense the software of the infrastructure of the global civilization, which is the hardware. We don't need to make major design revisions in the hardware. The hardware is how we produce and move around food, how we produce energy. The major restructuring there is simply a matter of cleaning it up, making it more efficient, less toxic, less enslaved to the notion of making a buck, more enslaved to the notion of serving human needs. So the hardware structure can be pretty much redesigned along the lines that are clear to even the engineering mentalities among us. What is not so clear is that culture can be redefined as software and radically rewritten so that it runs much more smoothly. Now notice that I did not say that we were software or hardware. We are neither. We are the user. And this is the important thing to remember. We are not scripting ourselves into some kind of machine future. We are designing the future that we want to have rather than allowing the blunders of our grandparents to dictate the kind of future we will have. We're very late waking up to the necessity for this. This is because we tend to operate along very short-term goals. It's very hard for us to put in place a project that looks 40 or 50 years ahead. It was interesting, a couple of years ago there was an article in the Whole Earth Review about a chapel at Oxford that the main beam of this chapel, which was an oak beam about so by so, was rotted through with worms and had to be replaced. And it was no problem, because 800 years ago an English king planted an oak tree that was to be grown for the specific purpose of replacing this beam when it should need to be replaced. And so this 750-year-old oak tree was cut and the beam hewn and put into place. And it inspired them to plant another oak tree, which is not a bad idea. Okay, well, so that's maybe enough about evolution. Now I want to talk about revolution, which is also in the solstitial theme, because what the solstice marks is the return of the heliacal rising of the sun to a certain fixed star against the background of fixed stars in our calendar system. What it really celebrates is the longest day of the year, the day when the sun makes its most northerly, its deepest incursion into the northern latitudes. It's interesting, the theme of revolution is dealt with in the I Ching, and since, of course, the I Ching was one of the 5 Confucian classics, you might turn to that passage expecting a discourse on political reformations. And when you look at the hexagram revolution, it says nothing about political guidance to revolutionaries. It says instead, the magician is a calendar maker. He measures the seasons and he sets them right. And so the last idea, maybe, that I want to leave with you tonight is a few thoughts about the calendar, because I have fastened on to the calendar as an interesting vehicle for changing people's conceptions of reality. I don't think we realize how thoroughly our worldview is dominated by the unconscious preconceptions that are built into our calendar. The Chinese understood this. This is why when there were great social revolutions, a new calendar was always put in place. We have used the present calendar with a minor correction for 2,000 years, for one entire zodiacal age. And we assume, I assume we assume, that we use this calendar that we do because it must be a very good one, and it must be the best of all, and it must be the simplest. And it is true that when you look back into time, you do find bizarre calendrical arrangements. For instance, I don't know if you knew this, but Roman months counted up to the middle day of the month, and then, like a rocket launching, counted down to the end day of the month. This is why the middle day of Roman months, which was called the Ides, was considered an unlucky day, because that was the day that the upward switched to a downward count. Well, we would find this very clumsy. But notice that what the logic and we've talked about logic, reason, and deduction this evening. The logic behind our calendar is that it is a good solar calendar. Well, what do we mean by a good solar calendar? Well, calendar makers will tell you that a good solar calendar is a calendar such that on the same day of every year, the sun rises in the same place against the background of the fixed stars. This is what we mean when we say the sun is in Aries. We mean that at dawn, the constellation Aries is blotted out by the heliacal light of the rising sun. But the sun is this solar, masculine, Apollonian archetype. It is the archetype of the ego as God. It is the archetype of the center, the unity. The solar calendar is set up so that we do not have what is called a precession. A precession is where the days slip against the background of the fixed stars. The notion of our calendar is that it is an agricultural calendar, and we want our great agricultural holidays to always fall in the times of harvest and planting. So a solar year must be used. But what this does is it has an underlying assumption which is false and which has been inculcated into our psychology to detrimental ends. And it is this, that this obsession with fixing the solstices and the equinoxes against the fixed stars is the effort to build a structure on the very largest level, the level of the planet itself, to build a structure that is fixed, that is enduring. And the great pride of our calendar is that we say it does not slip. That means it's fixed and enduring. Well, you may not know that the reason it doesn't slip is because there's a fudge factor in it. We're all familiar with the fudge factor of leap year, that every 4 years we have to add a year to keep it okay. But how many of you knew that every century year divisible by 400 is also a leap year, even if it occurs out of sequence? The year 2000 will be such a leap year. It is a century year divisible by 400. So was 1600. And so in that case, you have a leap year, even though the previous or the following year may be a leap year. So there is a fudge factor in the high and mighty solar paternal calendar that keeps it on track. Well, somewhat facetiously, what I propose, at least as a thought model, is an entirely different year length, 384 days. Now, 384 days is an interesting number. It's 13 lunations, precisely 13 lunations. And so we would have, therefore, a need for a 13th month in the calendar. And I propose that the 13th month follow August and precede September and be called Remember. And the month of Remember will be a month of great mnemonic celebration and recovery of the past. It will be a celebration of the past. Well, okay, now we have 13 months. That's wonderful, but we have purchased this 13th month at the expense of 19 days that overshoot the solar year. What about that? Well, instead of viewing that as a problem, as it has always been viewed, let's view it as an opportunity. What happens if you use a day length 19 days longer than the solar year? Well, it means that the great festivals of the solar year, Easter, Christmas, the 4th of July, will, let's call it Independence Day so we don't confuse ourselves because it's going to move, that these great festivals will do what is called precess. Each year they will come 19 days later against the solar year than the year before. So in such a calendrical system, you would be, as a child, Christmas would occur, let us say, in winter. By the time you were in your middle teens, Christmas would be occurring in springtime. By the time you were in your mid-20s, Christmas would be occurring in high summer, and in your mid-30s, it would occur again, it would occur in autumn. And through a life of 60 or 70 years, the solar festivals would migrate through the seasons. Well, this may seem trivial to you, and hey, it may be. But the psychology of it is that it's trying to build in at the highest level a truth which we have lost sight of, which is the idea that everything flows, that everything is impermanent, that flux is the only standard. Flux is the only thing you can depend on. If we gave ourselves permission at the highest and deepest psychological level, the place where we measure time and the spectacle of our life as spread out against the grid of the history that we live through, if we were to give that permission to be portrayed on a grid that emphasized flow, transience, change, and recursion, rather than this constipated solar square against the fixed stars, then what we are really doing, you see, is changing archetypes. We are changing archetypes. And what are we changing? We're changing the Apollonian solar paternalistic dominator archetype for the feminine, oceanic, intuitive, giving and taking archetype of flow and life and death and completion through change, rather than completion which seeks to stave off change and then is inevitably swept away and therefore somehow touched with pathos. Well, maybe that's enough. Maybe there are questions. This was somewhat meandering. I'll recap it for you to try and give you the illusion that there was a plan. We began by celebrating the solstice with an attack on reason and logic and in favor of the primacy of intuition in spite of its nakedness. Intuition cannot clothe itself in the armor of logic. But I hope I demonstrated to you that the armor of logic is wide mesh chain mail. In fact, it's chicken wire. In fact, it may be chicken shit. So the primacy of intuition, and how that intuition led into a peculiar episode in 19th century science where committed atheists found themselves serving the recovery of the alchemical ideal through the notion of nature as an engine of telos and progressivism. And then from that, the notion of our own century as the concrescence of this teleological process that is leading everything into deeper and deeper modes of self-reflection and connectedness. And then finally, to put the snake's tail in its mouth, to return to the theme of the solstice and to offer again a counterpose to the calendar of reason, the calendar of solar paternalism, to offer instead a potential calendar in celebration of flux, change, growth, and feminism, which are the values that are going to have to be maximized if we are going to open a dialogue with our souls and the soul of the planet, and save ourselves from the lethal momentum that so many hundreds of years of dominator culture have imparted to the machinery of our civilization. I mean, we must awaken, and these little probes, games about logic and calendars and shifting perspective on these various issues, this is just a way to promote cognitive activity, to say, you know, the path out of the selva oscura, the path out of the dark wood in which we find ourselves, is cognition, thought, getting smart fast. We have to dance, sing, calculate, and drum our way out of the circumstances into which we have fallen. And to the degree that we can celebrate the irrational, the feminine, the unconscious, the transpersonal, and even the psychedelic, to the degree that we can celebrate these things, we are giving permission for the order that is in nature to manifest. The plan wants to come to be. We have to get out of the way. And what that means is all the tricks in the book to diminish ego as a cultural ideal. I mean, ego is not a male problem, it's not a yuppie problem, it's not a white people problem, it's just a problem. And until we get this higher perspective, we are going to continue to rattle the bars of our cage. The higher perspective depends on seeing things on a scale of thousands of years and potentially millions of light years, a cosmic scale, the correct scale, the scale on which we are truly operating. I mean, the minutiae of our personal lives is that. It's that our lives are an opening into a transpersonal opportunity. You know? I mean, I've said this in my smaller class. I take the notion of Tantra seriously if by Tantra what we mean is the shortcut path, that life is some kind of opportunity. It's an opening between unbridgeable chasms of the unknown, and yet out of chaos, for 20, 40, 70 years, we come into a domain of immense opportunity. It is a conundrum. It is a puzzle. It is something to be figured out. And I have the faith that if we can figure this out, we can somehow not only make a better world for our children, but in some other profound way, we can even undo what has been done. And this would be the ultimate dream, that somehow we can discover an elegant escape that will leave us with the clear understanding that the problem was an illusion. It was an illusion. It was the last illusion.
What in your position is the effect of no myth? What has happened to our society, do you think, by virtue of the fact that we have the obvious cooperative evolutionary process about us everywhere, and yet we don't have a myth that fits it? What will happen to us if we don't get a myth?
Well, we do have a myth. We just don't call it that. I mean, our myth is the Faustian myth, that reason can wring the secrets from nature and thereby make man a god. And this is the myth of modern science. All of the alchemical dreams of the 16th century, transformation of matter, prolongation of life, so forth and so on, have been achieved by 20th century science. The problem is that our myth is a fatal one.
That's what I'm saying. Where's a myth that fits the evolutionary concept that you're into? I hear the calendar as a myth that would fit.
Yes, well, this is
what happens to us if we don't get one?
Well, what happens to us if we don't get one is we just drive this bicycle right over the cliff in the next 40 or 50 years. The myth that is trying to be born in science, and it has to be born there because that's the dominant church. The myth that is trying to be born in science is the rebirth of the spirit. The spirit has been banished from science, and not that long. Don't think that it's been that long. As late as the early 20th century, there were people like Driesch in Germany who were embryologists, who were looking at the morphogenesis of form, and they said there must be what they called the élan vital. There had to be a vital spark. There had to be a indestructible something there. Well, then, of course, DNA came along to explain that no, it isn't that at all. It's just these proteins are uncoded and so forth. But spirit has never really died in certain branches of biology and psychology. You see, there are problems for science. The chief problem is this one, that I can hold out my hand, that I can tell you that I'm going to close it, and that this happens. What you see is mind over matter. What you see is free will. You see mind willing matter to behave, and it happens. Within the confines of the body, paranormal activity appears to be going on. None of these hotshots can explain how you can conceive of turning your hand into a fist and cause it to happen. Right there is the defeat of 2,000 years of rational scientific philosophy. And they just say, yes, that's right, but we make great fighter planes. So I see Rupert Sheldrake as very important in the process of building a new scientific myth, because what he is saying is, on one level, completely outlandish. On another level, he completes a program that has been going on since the 1850s. Tonight I talked about biology and evolution, but there were parallel events in the 19th century going on in the field of the study of magnetism and electricity. And people like Faraday and Helmholtz and James Clerk Maxwell were discovering fields. Well, fields are extremely sort of metaphysical phenomena. I mean, they are invisible. They pervade all space. They can't be seen. And yet instruments can be seen to detect them. And not only that, we can transmit music and voice hundreds of miles. Right now, this room is interpenetrated by hundreds and hundreds of long-distance telephone calls, high-frequency radio transmissions, high-frequency television. We see none of this. If you had told someone in the 1850s that in the 20th century people would live in an ocean of invisible vibrational energy carrying messages over thousands of miles, they would not have believed it. Sheldrake is simply saying that the part of reality that science has hitherto been unable to account for is going to have to be accounted for by adding a field into the already allowed fields, which are the electromagnetic field, basically, the electromagnetic spectrum. Well, this field which Sheldrake wants to establish is called a morphogenetic field. It means that somehow the history of this glass is attendant upon it. The history of the glass has followed it here this evening, as has the history of the pillow and your history, and that we are in fact not, that the past is present in the present, that in fact the present is somehow a cascade of effects coming out of the past, not along the lines of causal declension, cause and effect, but also in this other way. And I think that there's a lot to this, and I think that eventually Sheldrake will be heard. As yet he's unable to stride to the blackboard and write the equations for the morphogenetic field, but this could come in time. And when it does, it will elucidate the hidden dimension that so bedevils our understanding, because it will explain why things are as they are. That they are as they are because they are a wave front out of the past meeting the boundary constraints of the present situation. The whole, my own personal effort to restart a dialogue on the psychedelic issue is because I believe that psychology has reduced its field of expertise unnecessarily by seeking to see everything as an adjunct to the functional or dysfunctional human personality. In other words, we don't know what the mind is. The notion that it arises out of the brain is something that the reductionists hypothesized with Sherrington in the 20s. My God, they've had 60 years to make good on this, and they've gotten nowhere. You know? How long do you beat a hypothesis before you proclaim it a dead horse? You know? Same thing with molecular biology. I mean, DNA was decoded in 1950, 35 years ago. And, you know, has molecular biology taken a significant step since? I mean, yes, I know about operons and all that stuff, but that's really the details. No understanding of the mechanisms of life have emerged out of reductionist biology, and no understandings of the mechanisms of mind, thought, and cognition have emerged out of reductionist psychology. So what we're going to have to admit, and this is a tough thing, but this is what goes along with intellectual revolutions, is the inadequacy of the present models. And the paradigm reformers are in for big trouble, because these paradigms can't be reformed. These paradigms have to be junked. It's junk. It's worthless. I mean, it's fine if you want to make fighter planes, but what does that prove about your knowledge of the nature of being? It doesn't prove anything. It's just a cultural artifact. So I think the myth that is seeking to be born is the rebirth of the spirit. And it's a strange thing because we all feel it. We all know it. But we live in such a top-down ecology of knowledge that until Time magazine proclaims the rebirth of the spirit, nobody's going to cop to what's going on. Yeah, intuition is this same kind of thing. I mean, the feminine is the same thing. I mean, I don't want to burden this group because you haven't stuck with me over days and days, but what I'm saying in my, what I think of as course, is that we had a symbiotic relationship as recently as 20,000 years ago with a vegetable mind, an organized intellect, a goddess, a spirit, whatever you want to call it, a mind that was brutally truncated. Our symbiotic relationship was brutally truncated by climatological and historical factors that caused us to fall from that state of grace, ecological balance, symbiosis, into, the wandering herd of car thieves that we are. And our ennui, our existential discomfort, our angst is a product of this severing of our relationship to spirit. We are the children of a dysfunctional relationship that we have to bring to the surface. And if you are what I imagine an ordinary person, this will start out sounding preposterous, begin sounding menacing, and I hope end up convincing you. We are worthless without a stabilizing umbilical connection to the mind at large in nature. And the way we have always achieved this is through shamanism, natural magic, and ecstasy. This is, in fact, what ecstasy is. Ecstasy is being in the presence of the other. And the other is not a philosophical hypothesization or somebody's notion. The other is the thing we share this planet with, that we as a culture have not glimpsed for 1,000 years because we've retreated into walled cities and walled languages and walled idea systems. We nowhere come tangential to the flesh of the earth. When we do, alone in the wilderness, then it overwhelms us. It moves us. It terrifies us because we have been so long away from it. So this is what the reclamation is about. The spirit is not some airy-fairy notion floating above everything. I mean, the spirit is something which, when it enters into your cross-section of reality, it leaves your knees knocking and your heart pounding. I mean, the path with heart is the path that astonishes. And that sense of astonishment can only come from an other, from a lover or an other. It cannot come out of the self. So is the other questions on all of this?
Your section where you covered evolution, you implied that this was the time to really take some intention with respect to the direction of our evolution. And I wonder if maybe that's just an illusion whose time has come. And it's part of the illusion of separateness. And the process will go on, and this is part of the process to have the illusion that we actually can play with it.
Well, we won't know till we try. But what we have very, very suddenly, almost overnight, put in place is, number one, an entirely global system for collecting information about reality and ourselves. We never had this before. We didn't even have it 30 years ago. Now you can find out what's going on. You can go, if necessary, anywhere you need to go. Within 72 hours, you can be on the ground almost anywhere on Earth, checking out what's going on. In the meantime, anthropological data, sociological data, climatological data, demographic data, political data, defense strategy data, all of this stuff is available. We now know at least what cards are in play. And this is the first time this has been so. We are now a global culture. You know, from the rainforests of the Amazon to the wastes of the Kalahari, from Nome to Santiago. It's one family, one people. A nuclear power explosion that happens in the Western Soviet Union is measured 2 weeks later in Johannesburg and everywhere else on the planet. So I think we are living under extraordinary conditions, that there are opportunities in place. The other thing is, you know, we're connecting 9 million computers a month are being connected together. Now people think that computers are office machines, but all of our technology is an excretion of the imagination. All of our technology is the condensation of ideological intention. And the fact that we now have turned our attention to information, the true stuff of reality, is a hopeful sign. For 3 centuries we've been obsessed with matter. We thought that was the true stuff of reality. Well, it turns out that's just, you know, nonsense. A flawed philosophical premise gave us this bias in favor of materialism. But with information, changes can really be made. And also, information informs people. I'm very much enamored of the notion of the meme. A meme is the smallest unit of an idea. It is to ideas what genes are to proteins. Genes make proteins, memes make ideas. And the way you encourage a meme is the way you encourage a protein. You replicate it. There are 2 ways of replicating memes. You can tell somebody, and they will tell somebody, or you can tell 2 people. You can repeat yourself, or you can tell a bunch of people. And the idea is that we are now, the global meme pool is now in place. All ideas are in competition, and it's a level playing field. This is, to my mind, what accounts for the overnight evaporation of Marxism. This was a meme which could not survive on a level playing field. When the playing field was leveled, meaning when a free press was allowed, that was it for that meme. That was like, you know, trying to sell flying pigs in Brooklyn. Just people are too smart. So it's not going to happen. So I believe then that memes compete with each other, and that the best ones are the ones which rise to the top. I have a real faith that ideology in this case will mirror biology, and that more and more complex and well-adapted and efficient and co-adaptive and mutually self-reinforcing and mutual community feedback and all of these things, that the memes which support, which maximize these evolutionary goals will fall naturally into place. And so this thing which happened in China was a struggle about the meme, because democracy is the idea that gives permission for all the memes to compete. I mean, democracy is very close to the heart of any anarchist. You know, Plato said you can always tell a democracy when you approach them from the sea because unchained dogs run on the wharf. Well, what he was referring to was the chaos and the disorder of democracies. So releasing memes into a competitive environment is very important. Every government on earth, no matter what a bunch of repressive, totalitarian, militaristic clowns they may actually be, they have to give lip service to the idea that they support a free press and free exchange of information and so forth and so on. The battle over that has been won. Now it's about how we interpret what we call victory. Nevertheless, as the little people in the world, I think it behooves all of us to seek to promote this process wherever possible. If you have a good idea, say it. For God's sake, say it. I mean, we're drowning for lack of good ideas. We need every good idea we can get. If the future is not going to be made of good ideas, it's going to be made of bad ideas, and we've seen enough of what that can bring. History is a digression. History is the briefest of all natural phenomena. It began 10, 15,000 years ago and appears as though it will quench itself within 500 years. It is obviously a self-funneling process that digs its walls higher and higher because it is going towards some kind of transcendence. It is a metamorphosis. It is not a steady state. History is some kind of process balanced on a pinnacle, and it either goes back, I suppose, into speechless animal organization if we blow up the world, or it turns into something else. But it is not something to be maintained. It is transitory and designed to be so. It's like a birth. It tears the planet apart. It contorts the people undergoing it. Before it's over, the heavy metals are ripped out of the surface of the earth. The forests are cut down. This thing happens. And then, let us hope, it is over. And we go to some less materialistic, less destructive phase. This is why, the question that the psychedelics raise for each of us as individuals is the question that the culture is going to have to answer collectively in time as well. It is, what are we when we can be anything we can imagine? I don't know. I think we are surrounded by mystery. I think the psychedelics, because they enlarge the dimension of mind, they bring the mystery in close. They allow us to contemplate possibilities that we would never have contemplated because they give us the power of the imagination and the data. How can we take these new datum that enter experience and integrate them meaningfully into ourselves? Well, I think that the way you do this is by realizing that the drama that is unfolding must be a human drama. So, for instance, the entities that are glimpsed in these exotic psychedelic states that inform the shamans and so forth, we say it's another dimension, and we hypothesize then that these are extraterrestrials or demons or plant spirits. We never face the fact that to redeem our own anxiety, they have to be something more than plant spirits. They have to be something more than demons. They have to be something more than friendly extraterrestrials. My own private opinion about this is I think that what psychedelics in these high-dose, correct setting situations carry us into is an ecology of souls. This is what we're seeing. I mean, if that's not a shocking enough way of putting it, how about this? What we're seeing is the dead. Those people, those things in that place are our ancestors. It's as though there is an ecology and a cycle of energy that reaches beyond visible life. There is an ecology of many dimensions, that life is transformation into a transcendental realm, that those self-transforming jeweled elf machines that are manufacturing the talking Fabergé eggs and the liquid crystal lattices of multiple fractal dimensions, those are dead friends. These places lie just over the hill. This is what is meant when it's said that shamans know how to pass through the doors that the dead pass through daily. That the adventure of being, I think, is not going to stop with saving the rainforest or feeding everybody or going off to Arcturus. That the adventure of being persists through time. This would explain the freakish immediacy and the weirdness, the charge, the numinosity of the contact in hyperspace. If this is an ecology of souls, if what we are seeing is in fact what we always thought we would never see or know, which is information about the next stage of existence, then this is a tremendous salutary force pouring into existence. And when you think about it, isn't this the most likely hypothesis? We know how improbable extraterrestrials are, and the only organized intellects we have ever contacted or had familiarity with are people. Therefore, isn't it likely that what we're dealing with are people? Well, then hypotheses multiply. Perhaps they're people from the future. Perhaps that's the future. And then we like that because it holds everything in the dimensions we're familiar with. The idea that it's the dead is a little more hackle-raising, a little more peculiar, a little more heartful, a little more hard to assimilate, and probably closer to the mark, that it is an ecology of souls. That's where we go. That's why they can make objects out of language. It's because it is the flesh becoming word, and then the word becoming flesh. That this is a cycle between two dimensions of existence, and only the shamans know what is happening, because only they operate outside the confines of profane history. Only they make the journey into the matrix where, for some reason, the living and the dead are co-existent. Well, this, just seems like raving madness, except that this is what every anthropologist has collected in his notebooks from every pre-literate group worldwide. They're into the ancestors, not extraterrestrials, not voyagers from the far future, but the dead. And it is, it has the ring of truth to me. This would explain this intuition that the psychedelics somehow have a historical role to play. Because, deny it as we may wish to, we are in a great dying. It is well advanced. So then, there's this sobering realization that, my God, what we feared most is possibly about to happen. Well, then, if we believe in the Tao, if we believe in the unobstructed unfolding of things from the first moments of the universe, then what we have to do is take hold and face the music. And I don't think it's that bad, but I think there's a hard swallow in the transition. There is a leap into this other possibility. So it is not simply an opportunity for a political revolution, or a social revolution, or an ecological revolution. It's all that. It's much more. It has to do with deconstructing the dualism of life and death itself and creating the ontos of a new reality that is based on the presence of eternity. That's what eternity is. Eternity is the present at hand hyperdimensionally beheld, and it is found to be a domain of magic and caring and mystery that mingles life and death as the only possible way of overcoming the contradiction. It has always, in hindsight, appalled me when I go into the truly deep psychedelic places, how casual one becomes about death. Not that you seek it, but that it seems almost a trivial issue, because these two things are seen to be all of a piece. There is continuity, but there is astonishment. We do not recognize ourselves. The shaman alone has the privileged vantage point to know what he beholds. And I think that's how we define where we are on the shamanic path. Do you know what you behold? I mean, some people come down and say pretty pictures. Other people come down and say dancing mice, hieroglyphs. Do we know what we behold? We need to know what we behold, because inevitably we become what we behold.